I don't really have like an intro. I'm just gonna record it and then I'll just kind of edit it later. So
Okay, cool.
yeah, man. No, I'm doing good. I'm doing good. Yeah. Thank you for the book. I
Yeah,
appreciate
sure,
it, dude.
sure.
It's good. I just finished reading it.
Oh, okay,
So, but I just started it yesterday and then I finished it today.
nice.
So,
Hopefully, it's not too long, so you can get to it.
yeah, no, it's actually like it's very well written,
Okay.
very readable, and very like attainable for the average person.
I know a lot of people have mentioned the first chapter was hard for them because I'm kind of talking about some terms and things they don't know, you know. So I thought afterwards I should have maybe done like a glossary in the back. I did it for my news book. I made a glossary in the back for that one, but because my wife was like, that first chapter, and my dad, Mindy, my grandfather, I said, just get to that first chapter. And then once you kind of get into the text and you go with it, it's actually, I think it flows pretty well.
Yeah. Okay. Sweet, man. You're still at Sovereign Way, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, I am curious. What made you start a publishing company? Kingdom Press is the name of the publishing company,
right? Well, first it started with starting my own journal in 2022. Journal of Classical Theology.
Yeah.
That kind of really just grew out of my doctoral studies, to where it was during my doctoral studies that I got introduced to a classical view. I never really kind of thought there was more what you would call, like, I knew there was open theism, but then I thought basically then there was conservative, orthodox kind of doctrine of God. But even within that, there was really some distinctions. We're recording.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I am. I don't have like an intro. I'm just talking.
All right. I just want to make sure. No, this is all good stuff. So I'm thinking I want to, this would be helpful to talk about it on the thing actually. But yeah, so what happened is it was actually through, like I said, I had a conversation with one of my doctoral supervisors. His name was Paul Helm. And we were talking about the doctrine of impassibility. And because that was something I had to do with my work. And then he said, which version do you hold to? And I said, what do you mean, which version do I hold to? I said, isn't there one? He goes, no, there's some various nuances. And he mentioned those like Bruce Ware and Rob Lister. And so he gave me some books to check out. And then he suggested another book called Confessing the Impassible God. And that was done by a group of guys here at the Reformed Baptist guys. Okay. Actually like in Palmdale. I think there's probably a handful of guys, you know, it's a compilation of various essays. And then there was it was really an eye-opening kind of thing. And then there's other books I got too. So all I had to say, I learned that, and that really kind of helped fuel my dissertation. And then afterwards, I kept thinking, man, this view needs to really be more prevalent, because it wasn't really, because you look at like a lot of journals, like even ETS, Journal of Evangelical Theological Society. Yeah. Like, I don't know, I stopped subscribing to them because it was supposed to be about theology. A lot of times it's a lot of just kind of like, I don't want to say boring biblical studies. Right. But there's stuff there just kind of like, and we need like theology. And there was actually kind of an online joke about, hey, if you actually want theology from them, you have to go to their conferences. You're not going to get it in the mail. Right. So that's where I was kind of like, you know what, we need to have like a journal of classical theology. So I reached out to some guys that were kind of some, you know, more recognized names in it, like Craig Carter and what's his name? Forgot his name. Anyways, they're RTS guys. And asked them about if they get interested in kind of teaming up and putting a journal together. I would manage the whole thing and do everything. And that's when I reached out to Fred Sanders. Okay. And we had some good back and forth. And the plan at the beginning was that I thought, well, it'd be great to have this journal under a school, like part attached to some kind of, you know, school. And so I started off by hitting up Fred Sanders about that. And so ultimately, as far as, because they just started a classical theology master's program. Pretty cool. Yeah. That'd be kind of great. So
well, we're at
actually I think it's at either Biola or Talbot.
Oh, Talbot.
I think it's Talbot. Yeah. So all that to say, they didn't work out, not because Fred didn't like the concept of the journal, it just as far as how their program was going was a little bit different than how the journal was in a sense, which is okay. But so it didn't work out, but I ended up like, you know, I just ended up doing it myself. Like I even went to actually talk with Rayful to have Gateway.
Oh, so this was kind of recent.
Yeah. 2022.
Oh, yeah. Super recent. Okay.
Yeah, to have Raythel asked about as far as like having Gateway be like a journal that's kind of in a sense backed by them. And then I guess you guys had gotten a new president, and then he kind of had more different ideas about wanting to have their own kind of own journal.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
all that to say, I said, I'm good. I'm going to do it by myself. I fund it by myself. So that got me started that way. And then by doing that, and also being involved with the trying to get books published and journals published, all that to say, it's challenging to get your own books published.
Yeah.
It really is.
I mean, the more I'm around academics and the more I'm around like the scholastic like entities, I realize it's super difficult.
It's hard. I mean, and a lot of times, because here's the thing: when it comes to a
Yeah.
publisher, you know, unless they come to you, for the most part, you're gonna pay for it.
Yeah.
So even my dissertation, I got published with Pickwick, which is the monograph division of Whip and Stock Publishers. Whip and Stock Publishers is a pretty well-known theological academic publisher. But even for that, I had to pay like $1,000, right? And so I get, because it's a cost on their side.
Yeah.
So, and I just know doing the journal and being able to do my own publishing, I'm a person who's really keen on aesthetics, how it looks, the presentation.
I can tell all your books.
I really try to, and I like that. I think that's one of the biggest things that I've seen guys self-publish.
Yeah.
And their books look terrible.
They look horrible.
They do.
Oh,
it's
they look so bad.
Times Roman font should be banished from everywhere. I hate that font. Even in academics, get rid of it. But I get why they use it. Yeah. All that to say, and then I knew that, like, hey, the thing is, what sells a book a lot is like who endorsed it. That's how I pick books out. I know I will check for publishers because I know they publish, certain authors, but for like, hey, if I get this book and see so-and-so endorsed it, I'm going to get it. So my thought was, well, if I can present a well-polished package, a book, develop it myself, I do all the cover work, everything. Yeah. But then it's obviously you want to have good content, right? Right. So if I get guys that read it and they endorse the book, obviously they're validating the work is good.
Right. It's a peer review.
It's kind of a peer review thing, right?
Summarization, or like, hey, check out this book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. Yeah. So that's what I thought. That to me was the big thing. It was like, hey, getting people to endorse. So like, example, when that book, that Olivet Discourse, came out, I was strategic about my endorsers.
Wilson and Schreiner.
And I got more on there too, on the inside. So, okay. But see, here's my thing. This is when I used to be on X, Twitter, whatever it is. Right. I'm not anymore. Honestly, I think it's a cesspool. But
I think it's been a cesspool, bro.
it has been. But even then, even if I just follow people that are conservative, evangelicals, or they're Christians, whatever it is, you still get junk on there I don't want to see. Right. So like, you know what? I'm just gonna get off of it. But my point is, when I published that book, I strategically reached out to about 5 or 6 people that I've acquainted with on Twitter. Combined, they had over 100,000 followers. So then when I went live with it from my page, I tagged all of them. Thank you for endorsing this book. It is now published.
Genius.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, I didn't sell no thousands of books, right? But it sold pretty well. I mean, for this year, Kingdom Press has put out of 3 books that we've published, we have 200 copies that have been sold. The first one came out in January, which is that one. My wife's, we redid hers. Hers came out at the end of summer. And then my last book came out in November. So not really a whole lot. But the point is, I have full control of that.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I have a control, and also the recoup on it.
How do you even have time to write? Because I know about like PhDs who like write a dissertation, and then from that dissertation they'll write like 2 more or 3. But you've written on 3 different distinct topics at this point. Where do you find the time to do that?
Well, so my latest book, that one came out of just I actually pretty much wrote all of that during my doctoral work. So I was working on my dissertation. I started doing this, just reading all the early church fathers that I had. So that was kind of more or less a 2-year thing. I would just kind of chipping away at that. Okay. Like on a Friday night, I would do that. But one thing I've been blessed with is that I basically work 3 days a week.
Okay. So you have 4 days of time.
For the most part, I do. Now, I have meetings on Tuesdays. And
I need to get on your schedule, bro.
Yeah, it's great. People think I'm a fireman. Like, no, I'm not. It's right. But I live close to work. So thankfully, the Lord has provided an opportunity to where I do have time. So that's ultimately how I got into then the publishing piece. I thought, you know what? I want to do my own books. If I can, obviously I earned a PhD, so I know something about writing, right? But still, even then, it's the funniest thing. Even then, just because you do a PhD and you want to like maybe submit like chapters to be published in journal articles, they get rejected all the time. Yeah. I mean, seriously, you think, well, it was my PhD. I had a guy that he submitted his article. I mean, he said, nope, sorry. And this is a chapter of his dissertation. And you think, hey, it went through a process. But the thing is, everybody obviously sees things from a different angle. My point is, it's very competitive, but it doesn't mean that people can't write good things. And one thing I noticed too, when it comes to run the journal, is that my more seasoned peer reviewers, they're like kind of really established compared to my younger guys. The older guys are kind of like real kind of laid back and, yeah, this is good stuff. No problem. Young guys, man, they just thrash everything. They tear it apart, dude. I mean, like really bad. It's kind of funny, but all that to say,
probably because they're trying to make a name for themselves.
I think that's part of it too. They're really kind of cut their teeth, where it's kind of like either things that are definitely that they point out the more seasoned guys don't. Yeah, they do, and vice versa.
I think it's partially like, now I get to do it to somebody. Because I know I know PhDs also, that they every time they write, they feel like they get thrashed by other PhDs. So maybe they feel like I get to be part of the thrashing.
Maybe it's something to be able to feel that they can be in that seat now, being the one to make the decision. And I get the whole point of it obviously is to basically to advance theology, right? You're trying to advance that in the field, and so of course it has to be under intense scrutiny, and this thing should be, right? It should be. But all that to say, back to your original question, just from that journal, learning that for the first couple of years, like, you know what, I think I want to jump in and doing this. And it's just kind of where I went.
That's awesome.
And my thought is too, also, as my plan is that the other part of it was to be also a ministry outlet for Sovereign Way, for our pastors to be able to put books together from their sermons, what they taught, and kind of craft it. And I could kind of really get, my thing was to really help with doing that. Like even like Pastor Josh Ritchie, we have a book on Jonah, a series he preached on Jonah that we're kind of working through. It's been on hold for a while because his job was kind of really challenging. Now he's got a newer job, which is really good to give more time. But so that, and Steve's book on apologetics, he's been really working through that. I think he has like one chapter to finish doing. And when I brought
for his second edition of his apologetics book?
Okay, so when I brought him a copy of my newest book, he came back to me because I gave it to him as a gift. He's like, "Bro, this is like something you get from Crossway."
I know, seriously. No, I know what you mean by the aesthetic appeal. By the way, welcome to Reform Perspective, man. So,
okay, thank you.
That's my intro.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Welcome to Reform Perspective. Good to have you back, man. But today I have Dr. Brian J. Orr. We're talking about his new book, The Olivet Discourse, a Preterist Reading. Like I said, man, I read it yesterday and finished it this morning. So it's pretty fresh in my mind at this point.
Good.
But so that just means that you can consume it rather well.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
I know we talked about this one last time, a classical response to relational theism. That's the first one we did a podcast, maybe like 2 years ago, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, actually, I have on when you give me your address, it was back in 2000 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I haven't been doing podcasts, and I've just been, involved with church planting and
heck yeah,
church,
school,
work,
family,
yeah,
everything.
But this is the one I want to eventually get to, but this one's going to be a lot more dense. I know it is. Grammar of Divinity, Divine Simplicity in the Development of Metaphysical Language in the First 4 Centuries. I don't know. You can't choose a smaller title. This is your newest one. Right?
Yeah, that was my newest one that came out at the end of November. Like I said, that was a 2-year thing I kind of worked on, and I ended up teaching. I did 17 recorded lectures on that on the Sovereign Way's Facebook YouTube page. Yeah, that's kind of how that all kind of came together. But when I do anything, whether when I was writing sermons or I was taking notes, I always write everything in a format as if I'm going to publish it.
Yeah.
So footnotes, organization, everything's that way. It's not like, I got to find all this stuff. I know that maybe I can take this stuff and put it into a book.
That's
because already the work's kind of done.
That's good. That's good.
So
I do not do that.
And I think writing sermons, people don't think that way, but I just have always been that way, and this is what I do.
This is awesome, man. So since you're here, I'm going to get your autograph on all 3 of these because I have the Orr Trinity.
You do the Orr Trinity. Nice.
I have the metaphysical language.
That's right. Cool.
I'm going to ask you to sign these, man.
All right. My pleasure. Cool.
And while you're doing so, I'll just kind of continue to do my introduction to Dr. Brian J. Orr. Are you an elder or a deacon or something at Sovereign Way?
I am nothing. I'm a church attender.
You're a layman.
I'm a layman.
Okay.
I lead a theology reading group. I started a father's discipleship group last year as well. And then obviously as things come up, but so I stepped out of the ministry in June of 2023.
2023.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I already signed this one.
Oh, you did? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. All right. You earned your PhD from the London School of Theology. In what year?
In 2022.
2022.
I'm sorry, my bad. 2020. This
2020.
was published 2022. Yeah.
Okay, so 2020 you earned your PhD. Was that in person or online?
That was in person. So I wasn't there. The way it was more of a distance, so I had to go there every 2 years.
Yeah. Same concept as at Gateway. It's like you go there for seminars, weeks.
Yeah, I go there for once a year for 2 weeks. I had to go out there, and then it was all because PhD research. It's not like there's no classes you do, and that's why a lot of people like to do the UK route. Is basically you just start researching and writing right away. So there's kind of two schools of thought between the UK model and the American model. So the UK model, I'm not going to say it like as if this is a fact, but the idea is that their model produces better scholars. The American model produces better teachers.
Okay.
Because of just the way it's kind of laid out, right? So, but then you have guys like, hey, I don't want to do 2 years of coursework. I know what I want to do. There's some people who are like maybe into it. They're like, man, I really don't know what I want to do. So the courses kind of help do that. But I know that American schools, I think Gateway they have been hiring guys that have UK PhDs.
That's right.
Right. So I think they want that kind of influence into their PhD program. They want to have a balance of obviously for the ministry, but also for academics.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but yeah.
Great. So you earned your PhD. Did you get a seminary degree anywhere?
Yeah, so I went through Columbia Evangelical Seminary, which is in Washington. Okay. The school actually 2 years ago ended up closing its doors after about 35 years. Okay. And again, it was not typical. It
was a young school, 35.
It was. There was no brick and mortar. It was just a distance program. Okay. And this was, I was so thankful because the reason I went there was that I was working full time and I was in my early 30s, and so I couldn't afford to move anywhere.
Right.
At first, I was going to Liberty University to finish up my undergraduate. And it was online and that kind of thing. But what happened is that I wanted to go to a seminary that I thought was a little bit more towards my theological kind of convictions about things. Yeah. And I just was a big fan of James White. And I know
is that where you went?
That's where he went. He did his master's degrees there and a couple of doctorates there and stuff. And saw that, well, maybe I'll just go here. Now, granted, I didn't know that it's not an accredited institution. Now, if you know anything about accreditation doesn't necessarily mean the school is a good school. Right. It doesn't mean that, right?
It just means they paid the fees and they're maintaining state requirements.
They have a full-on library. They have certain things now. Granted, now the Columbia Evangelical Seminary, they made sure to be in partnership with a lot of these agencies to validate that their work was actually up to snuff. It was, and so all that to say, it just was such a blessing that I got to go to London School of Theology because there was no way I could have gone to a PhD program in the States. Because of not having accreditation. Right. So they basically, what London School did is they basically looked at my transcripts and they also accepted me based upon the work that I submitted. Yeah. So I submitted a proposal and immediately they accepted it right away. And then they teamed me up with Paul Helm, who's, people know him as one of the most kind of like, reformed, well-known reformed philosophers and theologians. I mean, Paul was great. And then Tony Lane. Now, both these guys are Oxford scholars. And they're my PhD supervisors. Awesome. And I remember telling Kevin Van Hooser about it one time. He goes, "Man, you have the dream team." I'm like, "Yeah, I really do." So I was so thankful where I couldn't have got accepted here because of that. But over there, they accepted my prospectus and the work that I'd done, which kind of was a testimony to the type of standards that Columbia Evangelical Seminary has. You know what I'm saying? Like, as I'm saying, even though they didn't have accreditation, if I got accepted into a PhD program by my work, that speaks volumes to kind of the standards that school wanted to have for that they held against me in a sense, right? So that's how that whole thing kind of worked out.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
awesome, man. Well, let's get into the book. Let me at least try to give somewhat of maybe a synopsis of what you were. Let me see if I did it justice enough. Your premise is to give an exegetical examination from a preterist lens, hermeneutic, of Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 through 34 specifically.
I go a little bit farther.
A little bit further. Yeah, and you also go a little bit backward into chapter 23.
Yeah.
And your premise is that the block text that is like hotly and widely debated by all positions, eschatological, apocalyptic, conversations that happen within the church.
Yeah.
Is that your position is that the majority, if not all that is described in verses 1 through 34 has already been fulfilled.
Correct.
In the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not a popular position.
It is not.
It's not widely accepted in evangelical churches.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually not very widely accepted in most churches.
No.
But you do mention individuals that would probably agree with you, like Doug Wilson is who you reference quite a bit in there. And so the preterist position comes from, I know from what I understand, you're a post-millennial eschatological belief system.
Sure.
So because of that, your exegesis of this text, or your what you essentially get into is, what do these words mean in light of the preterist position?
Yeah, so I would kind of tweak that a little bit and say, what do these words mean to the primary audience?
Yeah, that's good.
Hearing them, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And let me say this too.
Yeah.
There are amillennials that have a preterist approach to passages.
Right. Yes,
they do, and they even, like I said, I think even there's plenty of theologians that have preterist leanings in that text, but they all kind of, at some point, and I say that, they all kind of jump ship.
That's right. Yeah, at certain points of the text.
Yeah,
like for me, there are certain points in the text where I tend to want to jump ship, because to follow it with a preterist lens all the way through doesn't always feel right to me.
Yes, that's a good way of saying it, right? It doesn't, because you have these kind of already these assumptions of how what it's saying,
just right,
and it's hard to kind of work through that. And
that's
I totally understand that. Yeah.
And so I've actually been doing that my entire faith walk since 2012, since I gave my life to the Lord. It's like studying things for myself so that I can know them and be convicted of why I believe what I believe. And every time I get to the text of Scripture, I realize that I'm more mature, I'm more open to questioning things, I'm more open to understanding and learning. And so the more I'm available to actually have meaningful conversations. If you would have talked to me when I first got saved, I would have been like pre-tribulation, premillennial, rapture, that would have been the position, and you would have been a heretic for that would have been my presupposition. Something that James White said, that I heard from him say from maybe like 7 or 8 years ago: if you do not know your tradition, you will be a slave to your tradition. In other words, if you're not cognizant, if you're not aware of your own presuppositions when approaching the text, if you don't say to yourself, I know this is how I read the text, you will be a slave to that, and your assumptions will be, that's just what the text says. So so you kind of hint at that throughout the book quite a bit. Is you do interact with the futurist positions, you do interact with other positions, which I really appreciate. I'm the weirdo that likes to read the preface and the introductions. So
you should.
Okay, good.
You should. That's what I do too.
So you say in your preface that what really brought this on for you was that there was mischaracterizations of the preterist position. And you yourself probably had these same mischaracterizations at one point, because you weren't always a preterist. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you weren't always a post-millennial.
No, I wasn't. I tell people this kind of joke that we can thank my dear friend Carlos Pamplona for that. He introduced me to the what's it called, the Canon Press app on my phone.
That's right. And that was one of my first questions. Like, what is that? What is the Canon Press app?
So the Canon Press app has to be, I can't think of a more incredible resource for theological content, for church content, for homeschool content, I'm not talking about just books. I'm talking about audio. I'm talking about history. I'm talking about, they even bought rights to old cartoons that they have on there. And the way the app is laid out, you talk about an aesthetically pleasing app. It's just incredible. There's thousands of things on there. So it continues to grow and grow. So on there's a lot of teaching on post-millennialism. Now, I do need to say this, is that, excuse me, my introduction to preterism actually did start in seminary. I did a course on eschatology, and so I wrote a paper called I think I called it Preterism Rightly Divided, I think is what I call it, or something like that. And the whole point was really kind of, it was a compare and contrast of a preterist perspective with kind of the more the futurist kind of approaches to the text. And so I just wanted to kind of read it for myself, but like one of the big things is that R.C. Sproul was a preterist. And so like when his book that I read was called The Last Days According to Jesus, I was really kind of blown away because I was feeling the same way he was. To me, it just, coming to the text, it made no sense to say we have all these New Testament books.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden now we have the first few chapters of Revelation, and then we just push everything way out. That lost the connection for me. Mm. I couldn't see I couldn't keep up with this jump and all this moving around from the various dates and then going back to Daniel with more date setting. I couldn't keep up with it. So I became more convinced I had a preterist leaning after seminary because it just seemed more of a natural way of reading the text to me. Mm-hmm. But I didn't land on anything yet because I kind of continued to move on. And I did like what a lot of people do is I made eschatology my like last thing. Mm-hmm. And it's not. It's actually the bedrock of everything. Mm-hmm. And so, but because I did that, I didn't really I wasn't dogmatic about it. And then there's like a lot of people that are newer in their faith and their theological journey is that you kind of gravitate towards people you respect. Mm-hmm. That even goes with their views of things. So me being a huge John Piper fan, I was like, you know what? I agree with him on everything. Where he lands eschatologically, I think I'm there too. Right? That's where I never like made like a hobby horse out of it. Yeah. But I think because my whole view of it was wrong, and that's where, like I said, over 2 years ago, getting introduced to that, it was just like a light came on. And honestly, it unlocked and opened up the entire Bible for me now of how it all fits together. It really does. So that's kind of how my journey went.
Okay, good. In your introduction, you make a reference to the English phrase, those who are being sanctified, on page 4. Those who are being sanctified is a Greek particle.
Participle,
which is in the present passive form, which means Christ's perfecting work is presently being applied to Christians as they are being sanctified by it. The theology of that passage, thus, the lens through which preterism... Sorry, did I misread that? The theology of that passage, thus, the lens through which preterism operates is redemption accomplished perfectly, redemption applied presently.
Yes. That's important. I'm glad you brought that up.
Okay, good. So,
because honestly, one of the greatest mischaracterizations of preterism is that everything happened in the first century, full stop, done.
And before you move on, just if you're going to be faithful to the text, there is you have to have preterism partially in any form. Yeah. If you're purely futurist in Matthew 24, you've missed it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Okay,
good.
Sorry.
So no, it's important you say that. Excuse me. So, and that's what people think. That people think that preterists believe that Jesus came back in the first century. That's what people will say. That's the most gross misrepresentation, right, of the position. But what it actually is that it's talking about redemption accomplished. Now it's being applied, and it's being applied through the spreading of the church. Those being brought into the church are what? Receiving redemption. The work was completed, right? But then the other part of it too is that they said, well, what is this whole thing about Christ coming back? Well, it's not so much that Christ came back. It's not that there was a standpoint that I believe in a literal physical return on a cloud in AD 70.
Which is the full preterist.
Well, even full preterists don't naturally can say that. Okay. All right. They might, honestly, I think the full preterists would just say that it was the presence of the Son of Man in heaven now manifested in the destruction of Israel. And that is what he was talking about. I see. Okay. That's what I'm saying. That's what they kind of would go to. So, but truth, I think consistent preterism doesn't say that. It says that the work was accomplished. Now it's being applied. And so the return that he was talking of was about the manifestation of the presence of the Son, now at the right hand of power, bringing judgment to Israel for rejecting its Savior, rejecting its Messiah. Yeah. So that was the vindication of the Son of Man. That's what that's about. So that work is where maybe a full preterist would stay there and just leave it like that. And then people would think, well, he returned in that way. You know what I'm saying? So that you can see how people can kind of grab parts of that and think, oh, you believe that Christ already came back.
So essentially they would reject a physical return of Christ, and even in the future, they would say like his return was just purely
There
the
are some.
judgment of the
There
second
are
temple.
some because you can, and it's interesting. I have a friend of mine who's kind of going through this kind of, I guess you could say, this toil in his mind. Is that when you think about it, there really aren't a lot of passages that say specifically that Christ is returning in the flesh, like the incarnation.
Mm-hmm.
There are some that we interpret that way, but those that are full preterists can take those passages and show how they don't really mean a literal physical body presence.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that way, but I understand how you can interpret something that way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where people get kind of mixed up. And so I have it, and that's why in my book I have a few pages on how we know when the Bible is returning to, or speaking of this final day.
Yeah.
Right? There's the day, final day, that kind of thing. Well, when Jesus talks about the resurrection of the just and the unjust, right? That's a definitive time of when he is coming to judge. Now, I would say 1 Corinthians 15 is kind of the key chapter to talk about
the resurrection.
Yeah, the resurrection, and about how he's going to be handing the kingdom back to the Father, because he's going to come back to destroy the last enemy. What's the last enemy? Death. Right now, that's the thing. We are still dying.
We're still dying, yeah.
And so that's where I think a lot of people would again, go back to the post-millennialist perspective. It's like, hey, how can you say we're already in the new heavens and new earth? People are still dying. I know. But the thing is that he's creating something new. So if there's no new heavens and new earth, and there's no new way already being manifested, what are the Gentiles being brought into? Right? So that's where that kind of comes in. Not that that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, no.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. And just a little bit further down, you bring out the primary issues that are necessary for Orthodox preterism, the basic tenets of the Christian faith. And I think this is true not just of preterism, but of all the positions. The visible, glorious, personal second coming of Christ, the physical resurrection of the dead, the final corporate judgment of all men on Judgment Day, the end of the present earth and temporal history, the establishment of the consummate physical new creation. I think that is essentially true for every eschatological position, not just the preterist, the Orthodox preterist. I think that's just primary issues.
It is, because obviously we think, okay, we don't have new bodies yet. And if Christ is the first fruits, if he's, think about it, we are brothers and sisters with Christ. And if we are being bestowed upon the same thing that he has, we don't have that yet. So there will be some sort of transition in a new embodied state, fully animated by the Spirit of God.
Okay.
That hasn't happened yet. Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. Good. You also say on page 5, preterism is a hermeneutical approach, not a full-bodied theological system. What do you mean by that?
For sure. So preterism is an approach to the text that and I know a lot of people say this, but I really am. Now, I'll be very dogmatic about. I believe preterism best exemplifies letting Scripture interpret Scripture. I really do think that. And so that's what it means. Like that, I think it takes it to the true dotting the I's and crossing the T's. I think preterism does that the best.
Okay, great. And then on page 6, you give 4 points, essentially. What are the rules of interpretation to apply? 4 rules to apply. You say to recognize the prophetic themes are most often set within established time frames. What do you mean within time frames?
So, for example, and we'll probably get to it in a little bit more later on, but when Jesus says that that this generation will not pass away before all these things happen. So he says about generation. Generation is a time frame. We know, biblical scholars in the past as well, pretty much understand that a generation in the Bible is 40 years. 40 years of generation. So if Jesus' words, this generation, don't mean this generation, then what can it mean? That means that all language, in a sense, becomes like irrelevant. So we have to say, what does that mean? And so that's my point, is that when you look at something like that, he spoke about when these things were going to happen. I see. So that's the time frame. And there's other things you can talk about as well. But I think that's the most clearest one that becomes like it becomes to me is the lynch point for this perspective is those statements of this generation.
Yeah, especially that specific phrase, this generation, because it seems like you point to it in almost every chapter, that is the kind of the foundation to which you interpret the rest of the text, because that's not till verse 34.
Well, no, it's throughout Matthew's gospel. And that's why I have the very
Oh,
end.
I
I have
see.
the
Okay,
appendix.
okay.
I have
Yep.
the uses of it. So the
I
point
see.
is, you want to say, how is it being used in the Bible?
Mhm.
And in every single context, it's meant to speak of the contemporaries of Jesus' day.
I see. Okay,
Yeah.
very good. Number 2, recognize that when it comes to history records, little is unique about our era when it comes to calamities, the plagues, earthquakes, and wars. That's so important to understand.
Oh, yeah.
That's so important because every single time there's an earthquake up here,
Mm-hmm.
I start seeing some of my friends, people that I love, trying to interpret that as like the beginning of the birth pangs.
Mm-hmm.
And to the point to where like I had to like write an article on my own like little blog post, like, are earthquakes spiritual events? And they're not. They're not.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny. I will hear then.
Go over there. Go over there, please. Go over there, please. My son, sorry.
No problem. I will hear people even in church saying that we see there's wars and rumors of wars. But the thing is, but they overlook what Jesus is saying in that passage. He says, when you hear those things, don't think the end is coming.
That's right.
Don't think it.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, good. Determine historical context for number 3. Determine the historical context before leaping to a future fulfillment of a prophetic passage event. If the time text is clear, one should search events within the given time frame for possible fulfillment. I think that's very, very important, and a lot of futurists have a hard time doing that.
Oh, they do. And I tell you, when you think about what Christ, again, it goes back to this generation. So think of yourself, okay, this generation, what do we have that documents a big part of this generation in his time? We have the book of Acts. We have the Pauline epistles. We have other things, right? We have all those kind of writings that kind of span out up until the destruction of Jerusalem. So there's a generation in there where you can locate who are some of the greatest persecutors of the church, the Judaizers. They were horrible. They were horrible, right? So I'm saying you can find all those things that he's talking about happen throughout the book of Acts.
Very good. And then number 4, distinguish fulfillment from application.
Yes, that's important. So I currently have a paper that I've finished writing. It's called The Coming of the Son of Man, Matthew 10, a modest reading of Matthew 10:23. And so I think one of the can't get my words right here, but I don't think the scripture talks about a double fulfillment. A double fulfillment in a sense doesn't make any sense. I think what it is that there's a fulfillment, but then there's application of what comes from that. To say that, let's just say, for example, that there's a fulfillment of a prophecy in the Old Testament, and that in its sense, historically, wasn't really the full of it. Actually, also happened now. I think is not what the original authors had in mind. Like I said, there's a view called telescoping, which I think is that I think it's an ad hoc approach to it, because really there's no objective kind of guardrails on when you can say, well, I think this is a double fulfillment. What in the text indicates that you can say this passage has a double fulfillment? Now we can see.
Fair enough. Yeah, you can say that about them necessarily, because there's nothing in the text that leads to that conclusion.
For sure.
In the text, you have to say that based upon your presupposition.
Yes.
If you have to read the Matthew 24 text in the futurist position, also knowing that there's some preteristic interpretation to it as well, then I could see how someone would be like, it's a double fulfillment.
Yeah, like what adjudicates you making that assertion about that? Because, for example, like let's say back to Matthew 10:23, when he says that you will have not gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. If you say that, he's talking about them now, and then he's saying that to this day,
right,
we are still going through the towns of Israel. That's what he's talking about. That's not what they would have understood.
Right.
Now, there is an application that, hey, obviously we are still in a cursed world. The gospel needs to go out. So we do have missionaries going through the towns of Israel as part of the Great Commission. But that was not what he was talking about in the original text. That's something that has to do with the Great Commission of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So that's one thing. So there's no guardrails. There's just an ad hoc way of doing it. And I think it's a misreading of the text. So my paper kind of works through that and kind of basically just kind of challenges that perspective.
Just out of curiosity, is that how you also read the book of Revelation and through that same hermeneutic?
Bro, I'm just glad you didn't say Revelations.
I've actually trained my mind not to pluralize revelations.
Yeah.
So revelation.
So I think, and I will say that I'm not, revelation is going to be something that I'm Lord willing, I'm working on this kind of coming year to really kind of get into it. I think I spent most of my time in the Olivet Discourse. I think it's a great way to say that, Revelation is kind of like John's Olivet Discourse, more in apocalyptic form. But I would say the majority of Revelation is speaking about AD 70, about the desecration of the temple, the end of Judaism, as far as a redemptive program in a sense, as far as the Mosaic law and that kind of thing. I don't mean law, but like as far as the Mosaic redemptive program is being pretty much pushed aside, done away with. But then you also have the Romans coming in, so that's all kind of tied in there. Nero, everything. And so I believe, except for the very end of Revelation, but even then, I mean, I will say this: I'm open, even in my current interpretation of the Olivet Discourse, where I do have a stopping point. One person that really challenged my ideas about that was Keith Matheson. Not personally, as a book he wrote called Age to Age. It's a biblical eschatology of the whole Bible. It's absolutely phenomenal. And so the thing is, he says, if you hold the view that the Olivet Discourse is the fulfillment of the Son of Man, then it's all the way through then to the end of 25. Okay. But the challenge is you get to passage, like I said, about how it's hard. Yeah. Separating the sheep from the goats.
Right.
That's a hard one.
Yeah.
Right. But there are guys that have shifted that way because they want to be consistent to the discourse. Right. So I'm not saying I'm there yet, but I'm definitely, again, I know what I believe. Right. I know that, that the stuff that we're talking about doesn't jeopardize my salvation.
Sure.
It's not going to lead anybody to hell, but it's all about how you see the plan of God being fulfilled.
Yeah.
That's it.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And come to those convictions by yourself.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes people turn these secondary issues. Because would you consider this a secondary issue?
Yeah. So it's a secondary issue, but I think it's a primary issue for pastoral leadership.
Like to be in accordance and of one accord when it comes to eldership. You mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like,
yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, prime example. Steve's preaching through Matthew. What if I'm preaching through Matthew?
Yeah.
And we're all you're going to do is confuse the sheep.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't think you can be that way unless it's not really a big deal to you. Right. I mean, that's kind of how it even started at Sovereign Way, is that it was me, Josh, and Steve. I think Josh was always kind of like leaning on the fence between male, but he didn't really have a bone to pick with it. Steve was very set on where he was at. I was kind of like, yeah, I think I'm historic pre-male, but again, it was kind of not a big deal to me. So I think in that standpoint, even our statement of faith, we do mention that there's various perspectives and that we, in a sense, recognize they're not heretical. Right. And so, and it's kind of weird that our statement of faith does say that, which a lot of them don't say that, but because we wanted to make that allowance, like, hey, we can still all be one in the Lord. Right. Different views. But I think having teaching pastors that have a very strong view of eschatology and how the Bible's plan unfolds, to them teach it, I think you're just asking for trouble.
That's right.
I think you really are.
Yeah, I think that's true. What I mean by the category of like primary and secondary is like the disavowing of primary theological positions for the Christian faith essentially is a damnable heresy.
Absolutely.
Whereas secondary is not necessarily a damnable heresy.
Not at all. Not at all.
So,
not at all.
And what I mean is like your position in terms of the interpretation of these particular texts are not second or primary.
For sure.
Things. And I think that's the issue. A lot of people have this.
Yeah.
They're so caught up in their position that they don't see their own tradition. And their presupposition underlines their conviction. Yeah. And so therefore, if you don't agree with it, you're a damnable heretic.
Yes.
Because you don't see it the way they see it. Whereas like me, I have a conviction. I'm an all-millennialist, but I'm ecumenical when it comes to like different positions of end times.
Yeah.
I'm happy to hear different perspectives.
Yeah.
It does not break fellowship for me whatsoever.
No, it can sharpen us. It should remind us that no matter what, we don't have it all worked out.
Yeah.
And there's been plenty of men and women in the faith throughout the church history that have held different views. They really have been. Right. Now, I think obviously a view that stands the test of time is a good indicator of something. But at the same time, we also know that throughout church history, there was, theology is in development, right? So,
and it's in community.
It is a community. Yep. So I don't think to say that you say, well, because the church fathers held to a premillennial view, therefore that means because it was that the apostolic proximity they had should deem it being how we should hold it. That's a wrong way to make an argument, right? Because then you would say, well, because a lot of church fathers were very allegorical in the reading of scripture, and they kind of really did not interpret according to like a historical literal hermeneutic in a sense. We tell it, it's bad. Well, why? Which one? What? So we can take their eschatology, but we can't take their way they interpreted the Bible.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Right. So it's not a matter of what church history says. It's a matter of what the text says, and we have to always be mindful of that. To your point, to our traditions.
Yeah.
Right. I think the early church fathers were brilliant men the Lord raised up at a key time to establish primary doctrines for us. I mean, seriously, what they had to hammer out. My book my new book goes to that. It's like what they hammered out, their logic, their interpretation of the text of how to go through every stone they went under. It's absolutely phenomenal. And they did it in a way that, in a sense, like we would never do it today. Like there's just no way that you would have theologians doing that type of rigorous theological thinking and theological development. Yeah. I mean, it's crazy, obviously, but it took like 400 years, right? So
that's exactly right.
So I'm saying, so like, that's what I think we look to the fathers the most for. Eschatology was not a primary issue. And you even have, I believe, I want to see either Irenaeus or Athanasius saying, I think it's Irenaeus, even though I believe in this way, there are many others that don't. You know what I'm saying? So you can't say that's the primary view of the early church. Right. Because honestly, if I recall, it's anywhere from like 60 to 70% of early church writings have not been translated. It's still out there. I mean, you talk about all kinds of stuff. The guys that first made the major English translations, the whole series, who are those guys? The Shaft series.
Oh yeah,
right. They were purposeful about doing dogmatic books, doing theological treatises, not sermons, not letters, not more of those things. I mean, they do have some of those, but the point is that there's still a lot not translated, and there are more translations that are coming out of guys in the early church, more in the medieval time, actually gravitating towards a preterist perspective, right? It's not the point to say it's dominant. But the point is, it's not like it's just this kind of modern phenom. It's really not. And that's where I think the misunderstanding comes into play as well. Also.
Yeah, and it also seems like there was a pretty broad spectrum of like different belief systems at that time too. So it just wasn't just the preterist position, but it seemed to be at least the overall idea, because Jerusalem didn't even exist at that time. Which I want to eventually get to this conversation. It's like, what do you do with Israel now? So what do you do with Jerusalem now? But
it's a very important question.
Yeah, it is. So but I want to first get through the book, right, man, because I think what are we, like an hour in? We barely touched the book. Anyways. All right. So in in chapter 1, you talk about you start to explain the meaning of this generation. You say in Matthew, in page 9, in Matthew 23-25, Jesus' continual usage of the second person plural in his address and this generation. Preterists understand this to be Jesus's immediate audience, and I think that's essentially the principle by which you interpret Matthew 24 eventually through the text. And how you interpret the rest of the symbols and of the clouds and of the fig tree and all those things is based on the foundation of this generation. So because this generation, in your perspective in your book, has to mean, at least from your perspective, it has to mean the disciples and that 40-year lineage leading up to the destruction of the temple. Because it has to mean that, then therefore everything that's written in Matthew 24 has to be interpreted through the lens of this generation.
For sure. It becomes like the inclusio. So it ends chapter 23, where talks about upon this generation will come all of the judgment for the deeds of what they did, right? And then he goes into it and he has that kind of conclusion mark saying this generation will not pass away till all these things happen. Right. So we all know that anybody that's gone to a basic interpretation 101 class, what do we say? Context, context, context. So if it's nothing but second person plural use, who's he talking to? He's talking to an audience there, right? We have no right to say, okay, he's talking to me now because why? I hear rumors of wars. I hear earthquakes. The world is getting worse. Well, that's not what he was saying, right? So, and that's the other thing that you mentioned, I kind of want to just tweak a little bit about as far as about this generation, is that we also too, we have to think of what would be the interpretive reference his disciples would know of the Old Testament. That's it. There's no New Testament writings. They're going to know when Jesus is talking like a prophet, like he does, when he's talking like one of them, he's using the language they use. That's going to be something they recall when they hear Isaiah using the same language, and they hear Jonah, when they hear Joel, right? That's the interpretive reference they have. So we need to stick to that.
Yeah, that's good. Let's we want to read the text of scripture together, because I think that'll be a good way to start getting the context. Because you actually started Matthew 23 after the triumphal entry.
Yeah, it kind of was leading up to that. Because here's the thing I want to say too. I want to say that I think the Gospel of Matthew, I know there's been that kind of there's been the charge that it's very anti-Semitic. The book is
right.
Now, on the one hand, it is, but it's anti-Semitic in the standpoint that it's a story about the king coming to his people and his people rejecting them, and then him judging for that, right? So in a sense, you're going to see those kind of signposts throughout when he keeps telling them this evil generation, right? This wicked generation. Like he constantly uses that. Now, granted, he's directing it primarily at the elites, the institution of the day, right? Basically the religious leaders, all that kind of thing. Now, there obviously there are those that don't believe in him, but I think it's a big primary thing, because the whole point is that the shepherds that originally had them, what do? They cause them to scatter. So he's trying to call them back. So now Christ comes, and they should have received him, but they don't. So my whole point is that you got to see this buildup of here comes the king, and then you have the parables basically comes to where the religious leadership says they knew he was talking about them. Like he knew that when he gave us the parable of the wicked tenant, right? Like, so they knew he was talking about them. And that kind of leads into him going to the Olivet Discourse.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Yeah. I don't think it's anti-Semitic.
Yeah, maybe it's the wrong word to say.
Yeah,
I don't mean like,
actually think it's very pro-Semitic. Jesus is very pro-Semitic.
He for sure is, but I meant, I don't think anti-Semitic would be the right word. I don't mean like in how we look at it today.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
But in a sense, like basically, this is a story, a progressive story, and Matthew's making a point to say that Israel's rejected the Messiah. Right.
Yeah,
it's very clear about that over and over again.
It's the story about the God of the Jews who comes down to be the King of the Jews. And rides in to Jerusalem, the capital of the Jews, and they reject the King of the Jews. That's right. Yeah,
that's a good way to put it.
But yet he does usher in the Jewish kingdom. He does.
Yeah.
And we as Gentiles are simply just grafted into the Jewish kingdom. So you start with 23, essentially talking about the judgment of the scribes and Pharisees.
So you have the seven woes, right? The
seven woes, the
chiastic of the woes, right? Yeah, basically, kind of, and there's a kind of interesting play where basically that's also being contrasted to the Sermon on the Mount, where there's the blessings, the 7 or 8 blessings, and then there's 7 or 8 woes, which is kind of interesting how Matthew does that. But yeah, so that's the kind of buildup, where basically he's kind of laying it all before them, right?
Yes,
and that's where he gets in the Olivet Discourse.
And what's text specifically? Do you start to draw this the term "this generation" from in 23?
So in 23, 36, right, he says, "Truly I tell you, all these things will come on this generation."
That's after the pronouncement of the judgment and the woes.
Yep, basically, and it's for the entire time, right? He goes all the way back to the blood of Abel. So he's kind of saying all this now is coming upon you. And one thing we know about God is very slow in bringing his judgment. That's one thing about the graciousness of God. And that's what even hardening is. When in Romans 11, we're talking about a partial hardening. The partial hardening is a way of delay. It's him not bringing all the judgment now, but he's delaying in a sense so that there might be Israelites that come back in. So, because the whole point of Paul's, Paul's treatise, and also everything else, is that how could God's word be true to the Israelites if he doesn't actually fulfill it? If it just now becomes the Gentiles, you can't go to the Gentiles unless you fulfilled your promises to the fathers, right? That's what he kind of aims to talk at. So, my point is that God has been slow all this time, and so even then, by sending them the Messiah, right, and then even after that, another 40 years, right. Yeah. So God is so gracious in that way. So that's the verse that kind of becomes the inclusio of the Olivet Discourse.
Okay, very good. So truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. And you make it very clear in your text. No one has a problem with saying that generation of that particular group of people at that time in this text.
Yeah. Most commentaries, they all agree that he's referring to this generation of his day.
That's right.
Yeah.
So in verses 37 through 39, this was actually one of the things that really started to helping me like question the interpretation. This is like one of the first texts in my walk where I was like, what does he even mean by these texts? Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on, you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That text right there was like one of the first texts I started wrestling with when it came to eschatology, Reformed theology, a whole bunch of like,
it's that's a go-to text for a lot of like Arminian perspectives.
That's right.
Yes,
a huge one. So this has been a constant go-to text for me to just to remind myself that learning is a process. Interpreting scripture is always going to be, you have to always approach the text with humility. Always.
And real quick though, the passage you read, by which I think is important, it says, when Jesus says to him on verse 38, see, your house is left to you desolate. He calls it your house.
That's right.
Right. Not God's house. It's now your house.
Right.
The Shekinah has left it. The Shekinah that came in the person of Christ has left it.
Yeah. Good. And when he talks about how often I wanted to gather your children, this is a specific condemnation to those scribes and Pharisees on whom he pronounced woes over. Is this correct?
Yeah, I mean, but even him lumping it, saying Jerusalem, Jerusalem.
That's right.
So, because you think about the Old Testament, when what was the language about the land, vomiting you out, right? So the land of Israel, Jerusalem itself was under judgment, and so I wouldn't restrict it completely to the religious leaders, but like anything, any kind of headship, they are responsible. So though you have your typical like layman Jews or just your normal Jews that rejected Christ, they're still part of that as well. They are. Yeah.
Good. Well, go ahead and read chapter 24, verses 1 through 36, because I think that's really the text that you focus on.
Okay. So I'm using the CSB, by the way.
Oh, okay. Well, I have the NASB, but that's fine.
All right. As Jesus left and was going out of the temple, his disciples came up and called his attention to its buildings. He replied to them, do you see all these things? Truly, I tell you, not one stone will be left here on another that will not be thrown down. While he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples approached him privately and said, tell us, when will these things happen? And what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Jesus replied to them, watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Messiah, and they will deceive many. You are going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, because these things must take place, but the end is not yet. For nations will rise up against nations, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these events are the beginning of labor pains. Then they will hand you over to be persecuted, and they will kill you. You will be hated by all nations because of my name. Then many will fall away, betray one another, and hate one another. Many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. Because lawlessness will multiply, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. The good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed in all the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. A man on the housetop must not come down to get things out of his house, and a man in the field must not go back to get his coat. Woe to the pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. Pray that your escape may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for at that time there will be a great distress, the kind that hasn't taken place from the beginning of the world until now, and never will again. Unless those days were cut short, no one would be saved, but those days will be cut short because of the elect. If anyone tells you then, see, here is the Messiah, or over here, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Take note, I have told you in advance. So if they tell you, see, he's in the wilderness, don't go out. Or see, he's in the storerooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the carcass is, there the vultures will gather. And immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not shed its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He will send out his angels with a loud trumpet, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from the end of the sky to the other. Learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its branch becomes tender and sprouts leaves, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away.
Amen.
Amen.
Reading that, I can already feel tension. Because there's things in there that I still have questions about. But nevertheless, we'll try to get through as much as possible.
Yeah.
And then we'll see. Okay. So in chapter... Excuse me here. This is triumphal entry. Okay. Yes. Chapter 2.
Okay.
Chapter 2 is when you start really getting into the text itself. And then especially, again, furthering the meaning of the word generation, the Greek word genea, in the lexicon. And you come to the conclusion that it has to mean specifically the generation in which Jesus is speaking to, because it's within the context of Matthew holistically, but also specifically directly because of Matthew 23:26. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. And in your perspective, all of Matthew 24 verses 1 through everything that you just read is a kind of like a further clarification, further how do I say this? Like more information about what that destruction looks like.
Yeah, like he's expounding on what he was talking about, what he meant.
Yes,
because the disciples asked him a few questions, and so he is addressing that. Yeah, and with the generation thing, I mean, that is a clear linchpin for it, because if this generation does not mean anything other than the generation he's talking to, then we have to stay within those signposts, those guardrails, and then now figure out, okay, then what is he saying then? We have no right to jump out of it. He's given us these inclusios to stay in on. And so that's where people get uneasy because of a tradition of interpretation that they've become used to.
Yeah, no, I have to be honest. Like, I've always understood it until recently. I've always understood it as this generation means whatever future generation is at some great time of tribulation, where there's earthquakes and pestilences and the sun goes away and the moon goes away.
Yeah.
And there's like cosmic chaos.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden Christ appears in the heavens on the clouds of glory. That's how I've always heard it.
Yep.
That's what my parents still believe. That's how many faithful Christians still believe.
Yes.
But this generation, I do tend to agree with you that this generation has to mean the disciples and those who would be alive and those whom he condemned in the destruction of AD 70's Second Temple in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Why can't it mean, though, also a second fulfillment in some future? Because I've heard it before said, this is a microcosm, like an apocalyptic microcosm. The AD 70s, an apocalyptic microcosm of some future eschatological macrocosm. It's like where this is a small scale of what's going to happen in the future.
For sure.
Why can't that be?
For sure. Yeah. Well, one is that, again, he's talking to disciples that have no idea of these kind of modern phantasmic things we're talking about. So what I mean is that the language, and it's fascinating how a lot of commentators, I think the one I recall mostly, and I could be mistaken, I remember going through John MacArthur's commentary on it.
Mm.
And like he didn't even once reference to the key phrase of what's called the cosmic collapse language. The sun will not give its light, the moon will turn to blood, and the stars will come crashing to the earth. Well, the prophets use that language throughout the Old Testament to speak of impending judgment coming, which happened very quickly. 70 years, even less time than that, right? So my point is like, that's what they use. But here's the thing. No stars came down and destroyed the land.
How come they weren't talking about the future? How come they weren't talking about 2025?
But I'm saying, but the text doesn't give us warrant to do that. You know what I'm saying? It's like, so the thing is, if Jesus is speaking in the same way, and he's using the same kind of language.
I'm being facetious.
But I know. But the whole point is like, it's kind of like, think about it. It's language that was used to emote a very, very world-ending kind of feeling. The reason I say that is that, like, think about this. The closest that we have to the type of empire domination was when Adolf Hitler tried to take over the world.
Yeah.
So if I was, in a sense, communicating using their language to somebody else, I would say basically that it's going to be so immense. It's going to seem like, right, the stars are falling. But stars in the Bible that I refer to in the Genesis refer to like leadership, right? To the leaders. That's back to Joseph. He talks about the dream he had, right? There was the sun and the moon and its 11 stars. Those are referencing his brothers. And then throughout the Old Testament, you see that stars refer to those in leadership.
Specifically Lucifer.
As well, right? So that's a good point. Yeah. So
is that the devil? But I don't know. I'm just kidding.
No, but we want to stay within the text and allow that to be our interpretation. That's the thing we think, well, he's talking about literal stars coming and crashing to the earth. If that happens, if a star came and crashed to our earth, it would destroy us, the whole planet.
Right.
So the thing is, if the prophets used the same language and what they spoke of came to pass, what was the aftermath? Destruction on the land, destruction of the people.
Right.
The sun didn't stop shining.
That's right.
The moon wasn't dripping blood or covered, right? Those are language to use. So it feels like that to give you the picture that the world is, how you understand everything is being dominated, is being taken over. And that's how empires worked. They took over. We aren't privy to that anymore. Again, the closest we had was Adolf Hitler. He was literally taking over everything. And so all the powers that be that he was taking over, you could say that basically for them, for that nation, their sun was not giving its light. Its moon was turning to blood, and the stars were coming down.
That's right.
It was just language used to describe something that was out of this world.
Yeah. Good. Yes. So this generation, that means those prophets or those apostles, those high priests, those Jews who are going to experience God's judgment on AD 70.
Yes.
So that's essentially the conclusion that you get in chapter 2. So that's the hermeneutical lens by which you interpret the rest of the text of scripture. So in chapter 3, when you get into verses 1 and 2, you start to kind of break down the text of scripture and the interpretation of it.
Yes.
So the leaving of the of Jesus from the temple with his disciples, he asks them the disciples ask him, Jesus says, "Do you see all these things? Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left on another that will not be thrown down." That's very clearly, I don't think anybody kind of questions, that's referring to that specific second temple that he was walking in AD 30 or 33 or whatever time frame that was.
Yep.
So it doesn't seem to me like that is a controversial position to take.
It's not. And then the question then becomes, where is the interpretive warrant then to kind of move away from it?
That's right.
Right. And that's what happens. But in my book, the commentators that I interact with, they start, it's almost like the last man standing. We're all running the race together.
That's right.
And verse after verse, you see one guy fall away, another guy fall away, right? They kind of jump ship because of the kind of language that he's using.
That's right. And that's why you only dedicate 2 pages to it, because I think it's pretty universally accepted that this is the second temple. And Josephus and some of these historians that wrote about it, they talk about the destruction pretty thoroughly.
Yes.
I remember reading some text of scripture or text of Josephus that talks about Jews as the Romans came to sack the temple and everything, that they were eating their gold.
Oh, it was the whole thing was awful.
Yeah. And I think one of the soldiers ended up stabbing one of the Jews, and gold fell out of his stomach. And after that, they just started eviscerating everybody because they realized that that's what they were doing.
Oh yeah,
That's crazy.
It was horrible. I mean, even the ideas of women eating their own children.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, 1 million Jews.
But that was war.
Yeah.
No.
Oh, it was when a siege doesn't happen over a couple of days. A siege takes, the whole point is to starve them, to cut off everything.
That's
For
right.
basically they have no way of even defending themselves.
That's right.
Either they come out or they'll just die.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just horrible. Absolutely horrible.
Okay, so Matthew 24, verse 3.
Okay.
While he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples asked him 3 questions. And you break these 3 questions down into, when will the temple be destroyed? So that's how you understand, tell us when these things will happen, right? So when the disciples say, tell us when these things will happen, they're referring to what Jesus just said about turning every stone upside down, essentially.
Yes.
Then the second question is, what is the sign of Jesus's coming? That's the controversial one that you have to essentially write along a big portion of this book on, is the parousia. What is the parousia? What do you mean by, why you got to use complicated words like that? Bro?
Yeah, well, I say parousia. That's easy for me. I can't say parousia. I had never said that way, but I'm going to use that word. So,
say however you need to, man.
Yeah, because I'll start tripping over myself.
Parousia.
Parousia.
Well, you said it more Greek.
That's how I say it. But parousia is been taken to understand. I think this has been the word itself has been, I want to say, built up through interpretive decision making, not so much maybe the world itself, is that this word is specifically of Christ descending on a cloud, descending on the cloud, the second coming of Christ, physically descending on a cloud. That is considered, that's the word parousia for him. However, the word parousia in the Bible elsewhere, when it's used, and even in the key lexicon of the BDAG, which everybody knows is like the standard lexicon, it primarily means presence. Like apousia means absence. So it means prescience. If you want to say the true, like coming from one location to the next, you would say erkomai. Erkomai is the moving of one place to the other. It's not used that way, right? So the parousia means the presence. So at his coming, it's being taken as an indicator of the presence of Christ, the presence of God is what's going to be the judgment that comes. And so that is how I would understand that passage.
Yeah, so in your perspective, parousia doesn't necessarily mean the physical manifestation or the second coming, the second advent of Christ.
Yeah.
It could just mean in reference to like some Old Testament text where the Lord comes, but he comes in judgment.
Yes. It's a coming of the presence and power of God. Now, again, I don't want to say this like that's lock, stock, and barrel. There's debate on that word. I understand that. Right. But when you look at the way it's used, even in the BDAG, there's definitely different meanings that can be assigned. And we have an understanding based upon the extra biblical literature at that time. But primarily it was used quite a bit to speak of even the presence of a dignitary or the presence of divinity, but never actually divinity coming down in a bodily form. That's what it's never really been used to indicate.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
And then the third question, what is the sign of the end of the age?
That's important.
And that is important.
That's important.
For the preterist position, that means the end of the Jewish, I guess, what would you say, elements?
Yeah, so
end of the temple, the sacrifices, the law, the things like that, or specifically whatever that Jewish ushering in the age of the church.
So I will say I've kind of, since writing this, I've kind of, I think, refined my thinking on this a little better now, where I understand that the coming of the end of the age is more reference to the Adamic age. I don't mean the end of people. What I mean is that we have the Adamic age where fallen mankind obviously is establishing his kingdom the earthly way, the worldly way. But then you have the second Adam who comes. That's the establishment of the second age. Now, there's still a connection there between the old covenant redemptive system, the coming to the end of that, the Mosaic system, and then now the birth of the new covenant. So you kind of have two things kind of in tandem in a sense. But I will say ultimately there is a transition, and that transition period would be in that 40 years. Because here's the thing, there's no way that in Paul's mind or anybody else in the New Testament that the temple could still be standing and Christ be the new temple that we are a part of. You know what I'm saying? There had to be a definitive, basically wiping away of the old way, because that was the shadows. That was the things that were intended to point to Christ. And when you look at how the New Testament authors now speak of, they say that Christ is the temple. So when Christ says, I'm going to bring this down, and in 3 days I will raise it up, he doesn't say I'll raise up a new one. I will raise it up. Well, the temple doesn't come back up, but who comes up? Christ, he does. Yeah. So the true temple is what he is raising up. So the old temple can't be there. And that's the big part of it. So that there's an end of an age there. There's an overlap period, which is why you still see that there are synagogues and the temple is still there. That goes back to the Lord's, in a sense, command for them to go and proclaim the good news of the kingdom to the surrounding nations, that the new king is here. And that's what I would understand that. So the age is, again, the end of the Adamic age and the uprising of the new age of the second Adam. Okay. Now, obviously, it doesn't wipe away death, that kind of thing. We still have that, but the language we use of in the Bible is that we are raised above. We are seated in the heavenlies. We are part of the last Adam, right? So as the first Adam was a living creature, the last Adam is a life-giving spirit. And we're brought into that.
And where within the text do you kind of come to a conclusion that encompasses the Adamic age?
Well, that comes throughout the epistles, especially in Paul's language.
I mean, specifically like within this text, or is that a presupposition, or is that like just one of your traditions that you kind of read into there?
That's me kind of later on kind of thinking through this a little bit more. Okay. I don't really kind of flesh that out as I have articulated it here, but I think in here I even kind of have an appendix thing on what I mean by the Old Covenant age, New Covenant age. Okay. Now, I think for the most part it is correct, because there is the closing of an Old Covenant redemptive system. Like that is the age of the Jews. That from that perspective has been closed. And the ultimate closure of that is the temple, because everybody to worship God had to come to the temple. Like that was where they came. Yeah. That's being done away with. That was never intended to be eternal. That always pointed to something greater. Okay. Sacrifices, Sabbath keeping, all that stuff, everything tied to that was to be done away with. It had to be. If there's a new order to come, the old order can't have any effectual implementation. It can't be there. Okay. So that's what I kind of really think of the old age.
Maybe this might be an inappropriate time to say this, but I don't know how we'll get to it eventually. But if the end of the Jewish age came at the destruction of AD 70, what do you do now with modern Israel? And it's unprecedented that a nation would just cease to exist for almost 2,000 years and then be reestablished in its original land. What do you do with that? Like, just out of curiosity, what do you do with that information?
So I've been thinking through that quite a bit. And I've come to the conclusion that I no longer think that Israel as a nation is theologically significant in God's redemptive purposes. I think historically it is, because salvation first starts with the Jews, right? So from that standpoint, but I think at the closing of the Mosaic covenantal system, that ended that plan, because the end all was never to be everybody comes to Zion. The end all was Zion goes out to the world, right? So obviously it was significant at one point, because God, in a sense, created Israel to be the vehicle of bringing his blessings to the world, right? So in a sense, you have the Abrahamic covenant that was established, that was by faith, right? He wasn't a Jew, right? He was a Chaldean. He was from the land of Ur. He was a Gentile. But through that, it became the funnel, if you will, to bring the Messiah. So one, God has his purposes with Israel, where in the Old Testament, he fulfilled that in the coming of Christ. And I'm still kind of working through a few things there, especially Romans 11. But my point is that was done, that was completed. God remained true to the Jews. He still is true to them. So as far as them getting to land, if we're going to use, well, I'm kind of going different routes.
Okay, I know. I like I said, I think I just wanted to gauge your perspective.
Yeah, so I'll say this for right now. I don't think that Israel itself is theologically significant anymore in God's redemptive purposes,
at least geographically and nationally.
Absolutely, yes. Okay. That's not part of it. I think that's a fleshy way of what they have, and that ultimately the only way, if you truly hold to a land fulfillment view, the only way they get the land is if they come in the name of the Lord. They don't just give or they're not given the promised land as unregenerate Messiah rejectors. And that's what he talks about. Even if you look at the end of Matthew 23, he says to them, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And so my point is that if, now I will say the New Testament is basically silent on land promises, absolutely, basically silent.
Yeah,
it really is. But when you look at the Old Covenant, Deuteronomy 28, right, the only way to receive blessings was through repentance. So it wouldn't be theologically accurate to say that the land they were given in 1948 was part of God's blessings because they weren't regenerate. They rejected the Messiah. You know what I'm saying? So that's why I think that's even that standpoint, when they were given that through NATO, as in a sense, not because in a sense that was, what's the word? Like it was part of God's plan of redemption for them. Again, they were still Jews. They rejected the Messiah.
They still do.
They still do, right? They still do. So that to me is like, it goes back to how the initial disciples thought that the king was coming to reestablish Israel again as a powerhouse. They still think that now. They do. And that's the blindness of those that aren't in Christ, that are in Israel, is they still think that way. And so again, all I have to say, I think ultimately to the point, theologically, there's nothing about going back to the land, rebuilding the temple. If they do rebuild the temple, it's not from a redemptive standpoint, it's more in a sense of out of sinfulness. That's how I see it.
Because of the rejection of Christ.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because he's a temple. It was always pointing to him.
Okay.
He's not going to go back to that. That was never his plan.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. All right. So what are you going to do if it gets built? No, I'm just kidding.
Like I said, if it does get rebuilt, that it's truly in spite of God's purposes.
Yeah. Okay. So even though, because there are lots of like evangelical organizations that are working with like very strong Greek or Jewish Orthodox organizations out there to make efforts of rebuilding the temple. In your perspective, are they going against God?
It's funny. I've looked up some of those sites when I've heard people say about, hey, they're in the plan of building the temple. Well, when I've actually gone to some of those sites about what they're doing, they're just making the utensils.
Right.
They haven't they don't have
and growing the stock.
Yeah, they don't. They just have utensils. They have the stuff they use inside of the temple. They don't actually have like blueprints and the funds and all the materials to actually build this temple. Right. That's not even there. But yeah, if they were to build it, I believe it would be definitely, it would be contrary to what God's purpose is. They're going backwards.
I don't remember who did it, who said it, but a friend of mine, maybe I can't remember, would say it would be demonic.
Yeah,
because to reestablish a sacrificial system for the remission of sins is demonic.
It's going back to the fleshy ways of doing
things. Right. Yeah.
Right. It's going basically, and that's what the book of Hebrews is all about. Do not go back to the ways of Moses. Those were a shadow, right? A sign. They were signposts to the true sacrifice in Christ. And now when you think about it through the New Testament, now Paul uses language for us. He uses temple language of us giving ourselves for worship, right? Romans 12:1. The temple language, even the water flowing out from us, is about water coming out of the temple we see in Ezekiel and in Revelation. Like all this language becomes directed at us in the Messiah. Like we, in a sense, become the stones of the temple, right? God dwells in us. It makes no sense to build another temple, a third temple, as that's going to be what God and God's purposes were.
Right.
You know, it doesn't make sense to me.
Well, I could see, like I said, I'm pretty open when it comes to like the idea of like of different positions. So double fulfillment, because I could see very strange close similarities to the sacking of the first temple from Babylon.
Yeah.
And the sacking of the second temple with Rome. So I can imagine some future Israel nation with a temple and then being surrounded by armies. And instead of there being a complete destruction of a third, that there would be a revitalization, there would be a repenting of the nation of Israel, there would be a mass like salvation and revival of the people, and then Christ returns as like a conquering king to like finally fulfill all of his promises to. Now, I don't think it'll be a fulfillment of like some premillennial reign
for sure,
but it will be like Christ comes back and establishes all of his promises that he gave to the Israelites along with the Gentiles in this new heaven and new earth, or heavenly Jerusalem. At least that's what I
and that would come from, again, I think, taking what they're talking about in the New Testament and pushing it out. So what I'm saying is that a double fulfillment would be to say that what this writer said about this historical thing happening
Mhm.
was also something that historically happened again later.
Mhm.
Like he's saying he's speaking about those as being the same event.
Mhm.
And that's where it's like we have typology, right?
Right.
We understand that we see things that kind of manifest throughout history that we see. But as far as what they were specifically talking about, that's where I think the double fulfillment becomes double incoherence.
Mm.
It really does, because there's no, let's just say that event continued to repeat somehow. You see, oh, this one's like that, and this one's like that, and this one's like this. These are all double fulfillments.
Mm.
Like, no, he's very specific about what he was talking about, and that's why, or if we break away from the text and we start kind of putting our own kind of time frame in there on things,
Okay.
It gets kind of murky.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you for letting me clarify. I know
Yeah.
we probably stay too long there, but
no, I got time, bro. I got an extra large Diet Coke here.
All right, 3 questions.
All right.
So, when will the temple be destroyed? What is the sign of Jesus' parousia coming? And what is the sign of the end of the age? Those last 2, controversial, debatable in evangelical and even any kind of really Christian circles. And I think you kind of get to the point pretty quickly with the first question. The temple's destroyed in 87.
Yes.
It's pretty clear.
Mm-hmm.
Old Covenant is destroyed in AD 70. But in question 2 on page 31, what is the sign of Jesus' coming, parousia? And what does the word parousia mean? And you essentially say presence and or appearing, with the Hellenistic use of the term indicating the visit of a ruler.
Yes.
And in your perspective, doesn't have to necessarily be a physical, fleshly coming.
Correct. And I say that too because to use that phrase from Daniel, right? That's what we're kind of talking about. We're kind of jumping ahead to really to the 24 or 30, right? The sign of the Son of Man is in heaven, right? So it's an assumption that he is talking about him coming on a cloud physically in the flesh. That's an assumption.
Yeah.
He doesn't say that you will see me coming on a cloud. He's using Danielic vision language, Daniel 7, to talk about that we knew Daniel 7 is about one like the Son of Man who's presented to the Ancient of Days. He's coming on clouds, not down, but to the Ancient of Days to be handed a kingdom, a people, a dominion. So he comes as an individual, one as a substitution, in a sense, representative of Israel or his people, but then you see also he's given a people. So the whole point is that his whole thing is that he is telling them that when you see these things, this is the sign of the fulfillment of Daniel 7. Not that I'm coming on this cloud. It's like, where would they think that?
Okay.
Where were they? So that would mean that we have to find somewhere. You can do it like in Second Temple literature or even in other authors that they understood that Daniel 7 was about some figure coming in the flesh, floating on a cloud, coming down to them. And I don't think we see that. Okay. So it's something that we insert now because of that kind of language. I'm saying we think, wow, that was, because what happens, I think the big challenge to us now, moderns, is that a lot of our interpretation is a response to Enlightenment criticism. 1800s, what did it do? It rejected the Bible, rejected anything supernatural. So what happens is we make a hard correction saying, well, we're adopting a literal historical grammatical perspective. That everything we see in the Bible, it has to be literal, because the standard used to validate historical documents was that those things actually happened. And that's why there was a whole idea that saying, well, hold on a second. We didn't see anybody come on a cloud. The sun's still up there. The stars haven't come down. Right. So either Jesus is a liar, or he was mistaken, or these things just haven't happened yet. Yeah. So it's actually a response to Enlightenment criticism of the validity of the text. So that becomes the pivot. We move it out. And that's where I think this kind of, again, we talk about knowing our tradition. This has really been inserted to say that he is talking about himself coming down in a cloud in the flesh. I think we add that.
Yeah, and I think you're just being as consistent as you can be within the hermeneutic of the text of this generation.
Yes, I'm trying to say, okay, well, I have to stay in here. I don't see a room to get out. I got to stay in here, so I have to make an interpretive sense of that passage. And where else can I go? I can only stay in the Bible.
Yeah, and I will say, like, I think every position tries to do the same.
Yeah, yeah.
But again, there are times where I hear specific perspectives. I'm like, that's very inconsistent on how you interpret these texts, because they'll jump from one to the other within like one or two verses. They'll be like, oh yeah, that was from the past. Oh yeah, this is for the future.
Yeah.
And I'm just like,
how
are you doing that?
What's your standard for saying that's from the past, that's for the future?
That's right.
Yeah.
Good. In question 3 on page 33, what is the sign of the end of the age? It is important to notice what the passage says. What is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age, the aionios? In this passage, the noun sign is masculine, governing the genitive feminine nouns coming and the age. And then you describe the Granville-Sharp rule.
Yeah.
That is that the word aionios governs the meaning of the coming and the age. And what do you mean by that? Just to break that down a little bit.
Yeah. So the Granville-Sharp rule has about 80%, I think, applicability to the New Testament, where basically it says that the way it's constructed, that both nouns are governed by the and. So, for example, when it says a famous passage when it says Jesus, our God and Savior, right? So the way it's set up in the Greek, that it's not saying those are distinct, right? So it's the same. So the same thing applies here, where basically the coming and the age are the same. So it's going to be at the same time in a sense. And the age doesn't mean the end of the world. It means age. Ion has been translated to say world. I think the King James does that kind of thing. So these things are going to be together. They're going to happen together. It's referring to the same event, if you will.
So this parousia and this aionios are the same.
Yes. When it they're not synonyms, but when they occur, it's the same thing. There's going to be a coming and the end of the age.
Okay.
Yes.
In page 35, you say, because the disciples did not understand that it was a spiritual kingdom, they assumed Jesus' prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem was the great day of judgment, which they knew was to happen at the second coming of the Lord. And that is why they ask, what shall be the sign of your coming? I didn't think that your point is most people, in your perspective, make that same assumption or mistake.
Yes. Now, I want to say one thing.
Sorry about that.
Let's see. Because this happens to understand, I think... I know I put that they knew which they knew was to happen at the second coming of the Lord. I think I'm kind of now hesitant of how I phrase that, where I don't think they really even at this time could really contemplate a second coming when they never even thought of him actually leaving anywhere. Like that was even their mind. So even the second coming piece, I think even that standpoint, unless they thought the second coming was actually him coming as a true king in a sense. But as far as like the second coming as a coming fleshly from the sky in the cloud, I don't think they thought that. So I think the way I worded it, I don't think it's entirely clear as it should be.
But from your perspective, when they asked Christ,
yes,
what will be the sign of your coming?
Sign, yes.
They were not thinking of a fleshly second coming. They were thinking of like, he's coming to establish the kingdom.
Yeah. What is the sign, right, that you are establishing your kingdom? That's how you understand it. When this order is coming. And so the sign,
because they probably thought that he was going to do it when he rode into Jerusalem, and they were all praising, and they're like, all right, this is it,
Absolutely.
And so then he leaves almost like defeated, and he's like, this is all going to be torn down.
Yeah. I mean, think about, wait, this is your temple. What do you mean? And think about it, completely bewilderment, completely backwards. And that's why there's a difference in the new covenant hermeneutic when it goes back to think about the woman at the well in John 4, right? She talks about different mountains to go worship on. He's like, girl, now's the time, right? We're going to worship in spirit and truth. Not this mountain, not that mountain. I mean, and then Nicodemus say, what? How do I get born again? I have to go back up with my mom?
Yeah.
No. So my point is that there's completely revolutionary way of thinking in the spirit now. They're thinking in the spirit and truth. And so they still have this idea of an old earthly kingdom. Like you're going to come into your kingdom that's already here and reestablish it now to make Israel as a nation a powerhouse, your temple, your kingdom, everything. It's like, no, bro, it's coming down. well, then what's the sign that you're actually going to be coming as a king? Like, what is it? What do I look for? That's going to be him, what? Bringing down the Jerusalem, right? Carrying out his own decree of judgment against Israel and Jerusalem for rejecting his Messiah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because one thing too, that it says, like some translation will say, the sign will appear in the sky, but it's actually the sign
of your coming.
It's heavens, not like, and so we can't be looking for something in the sky. It's about the sign that the Son of Man is in heaven.
That's right. I think you actually make a reference to that.
I kind of lay it out.
Yeah,
in the
you
Greek
say
word,
it specifically. Yeah.
It's the sign that the Son of Man is in heaven. That's really kind of how I think the phrasing of it should be. And so the whole point is, what do I look for us to know that the King has been enthroned? The King. That's what. Well, once you see this, right? Boom, this coming down Jerusalem, that's how you know. But I'm giving everybody a warning for 40 years, right? The generation, just so you know, this is what's going to happen. Because remember, the whole point is for God to fulfill his promise to Israel. So God, what is he doing? He's telling them to go out to the nations to call Israel to repent, saying, your king is here. Your Messiah is here. So as God waits for, and I think Paul in 2 Thessalonians talks about the filling up of their sins. I think it's 1 Thessalonians, the measure of their sins filling up. Like that's what part of this transition is for, is that God in his grace didn't come and just destroy all of them. He's actually giving them another warning. Even though you've rejected my Messiah, I'm giving you 40 years to repent and come into the people of God before I bring everything down. And that's where the true sign is saying that Israel as a nation, the redemptive history of a redemptive system is gone. The new king is here. That's what they were looking for. And that's what he was talking about.
Okay. You also, in page 36, talk about this 2-age perspective. Okay. The closing of one age and the age to come, emerging out of the destruction of the end of the age. You write specifically in chapter 36, or excuse me, page 36. Gerhardus Voss sees this paradigm as two spheres of being emerging, though always having coexisted in the revelation of the Messiah and his kingdom. These spheres can be traced out in the designation of this age / the present age, and that age / the future age. In the two spheres of being, this age posits an ethical or spiritual realm rather than a period of time. Yeah. You can break that down a little bit, man.
Yeah, so definitely, and that's why I even gave an index to this, right? So the whole idea is that as we are in the age of Adam, we're in this fallen state. How you want to picture on a timeline as we're moving this way. Okay, then Christ comes, because remember, the whole point is that the earth, in a sense, pointed towards the heavens, the heavenly realms, because everything's about God coming down, the kingdom of heaven coming down. That is where we are said to be seated with Christ. Where the scripture said we are reigning with Christ. But Paul even talks about about this age, the God of this age, or John says that, but it even says about the present distress in this age. And I have the various passages. So what's happening is that, and what Gerhardus Voss kind of makes the case for, is that even though we're in this age, because we're still in our sin, there's still death, being in Christ now moves us into the age up here. So when it says that the God of this world, right, over the age, well, he's over this world, not up here above us in the heavens. Because why? The church has thrown him out. Christ has thrown that out. So in a sense, so we go on together, almost parallel. So we're in this age here of where there's still death, right? There's still sin, but in Christ now we are in the heavenlies, in that age, the spiritual age of wisdom. That's why it says that the rulers of this age didn't know what they were getting into, right? So like we now have that wisdom in Christ. So the timeline is moving like this. Believers are up here, though we're still physically walking here. In the spirit, we are now part of this age. So that's how Voss kind of works through that. And
that's that now and not yet.
That's reality. Yes, right. That's, and I don't think he uses that now and not yet. I think it's more of a George Ladd term. Okay. But that's to kind of account for that we are, how we can talk about being new creations. Right. It's not about this, it's about being new creations in Christ. Paul uses that language. I think I talk about the various creation language passages. No, actually it's in a paper that I wrote about that everything in the Testament is transformative of creation. So he's not destroying it, he's transforming it. So Paul talks that way. The authors talk that way. We can say that we are truly in the heavenlies with Christ, even though we are positionally in the flesh on this earth. And that's the kind of two-age kind of theories moving together.
But hasn't that been true since the beginning of time? Like ever since God spoke creation into being, is that this eternal state has always coexisted in line of the temporal?
But now we get to share in it.
Right. Because of the, well, it seems like, well, this is why I think covenantal theology is important, because it exposes it further and further as you reach Christ. And it's not that the eschaton reaches necessarily back, but rather we're always moving forward into the eschaton.
Yes, we are. And that also points out a Jewish theology thought there was like a curtain between, man space and God space. And so when you have the Son of Man, who's one from earth, even though it's Christ taking on that flesh, now in a sense goes into the heavens, now you have a representative from earth that's resurrected, and to now bring humanity truly into the heavenly realm, the other age. Adam lost that. And so Christ, the second Adam, reestablishes that connection. Yeah.
Okay. Then you mentioned in page 37, this age applies to the temporal realm of the fallen world. The age to come speaks of the heavenly realm of redeemed immoral humanity. The age to come, then, is the eschatological reality of the kingdom ushered in by its Messiah and the coming of the Spirit. I think that's just, I like it. I agree with it. I think the problem I have essentially is understanding how that applies essentially to this generation.
Well, I think, remember, the generation focuses more on the historical fulfillment of this being accomplished. Back at the beginning, is redemption accomplished and applied. Okay. The second age is the application of the kingdom coming, of Christ establishing his reign at the right hand. That's what flows from that. Yeah.
Okay, very good. In verses 4 through 5, you essentially talk about multiple deceivers, false prophets. Many will come in my name, saying, I am the Messiah, and they will deceive many. I think a large majority of people do agree that this was reference to false messiahs that would appear after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and how they tried to lead many astray. Some tend to also apply that into some future aspect where there will be like another like big push of false messiahs. That's still true today. Like there's false messiahs today as well, and they tend to apply antichrist to false messiah, and also anybody who claims to be Jesus as these false messiahs that would arise
for sure
before the end of the age. But in your perspective, these false messiahs are specifically individuals who promise liberation and freedom and safety and redemption from impending doom coming at them from the Romans. And Jesus is saying, like,
don't listen
to those.
And actually, what you said is helpful as far as kind of, again, repositioning ourselves, is because you mentioned about people thinking about this stuff now. But remember, the Olivet Discourse up to verse 36, in a sense, is that Jesus is telling them what to look for as signs of things happening. So the point is that if he's telling them for these things to look for, then that means they have to see them.
Right.
They can't. Yeah, right. They have to see them.
That's
so
right. And they did.
That's so important.
And the point is that they did.
They did.
Josephus talks about them.
Yep.
I think even Eusebius, I could be wrong about that. I think Eusebius even writes a little bit about them, but specifically the text of Scripture speaks about them. I think that's the most important part, is that you annotate in Acts chapter 5, Gamaliel, a highly respected Pharisee, spoke of pretenders in their midst, where it says that some time ago Theudas rose up claiming to be somebody, and a group of about 400 men rallied to him, and he was killed, and all his followers were dispersed and came to nothing. So essentially, this was like a type of Messiah prior to Christ who claimed to be some kind of leader, some kind of figure, and that came to nothing. And then you also say that Gamaliel mentions in the text of Scripture Judas the Galilean, who also rose up, and it seems to be before Christ also. Again, Josephus also talks about messiahs that rose up after Christ.
Apostle John,
the Apostle John,
Antichrists are many. They're here.
That's right. Yes.
So I mean, they are there, and so that's why I only have like a page and a half, because every commentator knew yes, there's plenty of documentation saying there was plenty of these guys out there.
That's right. And so futurists tend to attribute this text to the Antichrist, the head figure. Little ones will come, and then there will be some big one, right?
Which I don't believe, by the way.
So I would assume that's what you.
That's my next book.
Yeah.
Really?
Okay.
I'm working on a little plug. I'm working on a reception history of 2 Thessalonians 2, 1-8.
Okay.
Which can have a reception history of how the church has understood this passage, and then at the end, I'm going to make an argument that is more in line with a preterist perspective.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
Okay.
So in Matthew 24:6-8, you're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, because these things must take place. But the end, then specifically the end, there is the end of the age is not yet. Is that your perspective there?
Yeah, not the end of the world. The end of this Old Covenant age, Old Testament age is coming to an end. Yes.
Yep. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines, earthquakes in various places. Then again, you go into historical and biblical evidences.
Yep.
There's specifically in the book of Acts where, what's the Agabus? Mm-hmm. Is that the name of the prophet? I believe.
Yes.
Agabus? Is it Agabus?
Yes. Hold on. Yes,
okay.
Agabus.
Okay.
Yes. Yep.
Agabus kind of predicts a famine that's going to sweep across
the Roman world.
The Roman world specifically hits Jerusalem very hard.
Mm-hmm.
I think even Paul raises up funds to be able to help aid those who were impacted by some of these famines.
Yes.
And then you also talk about tremors and earthquakes. At the death of Christ, there's a massive earthquake.
Yep.
There's other earthquakes mentioned in the book of Acts, I believe. And then even Josephus writes about these tremors.
Mm-hmm.
And then these factions that rise up within Jerusalem.
Yes.
Historically speaking, you talk about these tumults, these periods of commotion and rebellion against the Roman powers that essentially lead to what's the name of the war? The Jewish War?
Jewish War, yes, that comes on. And remember too, when we think about, nations rise up against nations, nationalism is a modern thing. Really, like Italy wasn't even a country 160 years ago. 180 years ago. Like it became a country by all the little nations becoming united as one, right? So that kind of idea of how we think nations is a little different. So really within this period, in this kind of like Roman providence, I think it's like 119 little nations in there, right? So the point is it's not a huge area. And so I can see how someone could read my evidence and think, really, that was it? Like that was all that there was? Because the idea is that the assumption is this has to be a global thing. We're going to watch those movies called like Impact, or a meteor comes and all this stuff happens. Like that's the kind of mindset that kind of gets imported here. But even in what's his name? Gary DeMar in his book, Last Day Madness, I didn't include it, but he's got like historical samples that they have of because they still recorded earthquakes at that time.
Right.
And there's literally like 10 to 20,000 earthquakes that have been recorded in history during this time frame. And they've always been that way. We find them all over the place. So that's not like a new phenomenon. And the whole point of it is that he's telling them things that you're going to see to not be worried about that. Not as pointing to the end, as not to think that these are signs of the end. But so many people get it backwards. I've heard people at church say it.
Yeah, good. I don't think that's a big deal. Futurists tend to read all of this in terms of the future.
Yes.
Which I have a hard time doing that now, but I would have agreed wholeheartedly with the futurist when I first got saved, when I first started reading this, because that's how I was taught to interpret it. And then they would go back when it comes to Matthew 24 and verse 9-14, when they're going to be persecuted and they're going to be killed and they're going to be hated. They would say like, "Oh, that's back in the past again. That's talking about the Jews." And I'm like, I don't know how you guys make that jump. I don't know how to stay consistent for the futurist position who claims that these positions are double fulfillment. Because they'll say that's true, that happened all with Jerusalem, but that will happen again in the future. But in your perspective, that only happened in AD 70.
Because these are the things that Jesus told his audience to be looking for and what will happen to you guys. Because the whole thing is, again, it's the second person plural. Man, he's talking about them. And so if he was speaking like in the third person, if he said at some point, our church, our people will ... that's not how he talks. He's given things to be looking for as you see this age come to a close. And the ultimate sign will be the Son of Man.
Yeah.
The fulfillment of Daniel 7. Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. You give a lot of scriptural evidences of the different kinds of oppression and persecution that they faced. Specifically, you talk about the false prophets, people who claim to be the false Messiah. They will rise up. You talk about how in John's first epistle that there will be those who went out from us, or who are not from us, but went out of us, essentially saying that they were at one point part of the church or even part of the apostles.
Yes, because the language is used is kind of like sending language, because he starts the way about talking about them, and the us, John's us has been always kind of a reference to them as apostles. He starts that way. So again, that's I put that in. I thought it was an interesting way of looking at it. I think somebody would be like, well, that's not what he's saying. Well, I mean, I guess the point is, again, if we're staying within this near context, again, you have to think to yourself, like, if this was something that was so presently important and in a sense kind of like urgent, but like we're still 2,000 years waiting for it, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't, right? Again, it goes back to what's been accomplished and what's been applied, and when we know that the standpoint is that if the purpose of God's church, the purpose of his plans is to redeem the world, to spread the glory of Christ over it, and he's going to bring down one enemy after another, obviously we're going to face that as Christians. So it's not a double fulfillment. It's an application.
That's okay.
It's an application of what happens. It's a meeting out of fulfillment of the kingdom of God coming up against the kingdom of man. Right. So you're going to experience that. And I mean, here's the thing. The question is that I think I heard a guy tell me this. He says that so many Christians live like in an Old Testament before Christ mentality. What he meant by that is that if we automatically take this, what's happened here, and say, look, see, we are to be persecuted. We are to be persecuted. Now, granted, that happens, right, but there's so many people in so much of the world that haven't gone through that. They live their life very comfortably.
America,
right? I mean, even the Puritans, they had their areas, but overall, it's like, think about it. John Owen, he lost all of his kids, 11 of them. He could say the world is getting worse and worse and worse because I lost all 11 kids. Yeah. He never thought that way, right? So my point is that we have to realize that the situation going on here, because remember, the letters of Scripture were situationally given to us. Most of them were. They were, right? I mean, think about the epistles from Paul, right? Dealing with issues happening then and there, but then we can apply them to us now. It's not us going back in there and saying, look, all these things they went through, that means we are going through it, and that's the sign that we are truly believers. And I think, again, there's a time and a place for that. Are there, I know in China right now, under that communist regime, is it serious persecution? It is, but what's happening? You have believers cropping up all over the place. That's right. That's how he brings down enemies, not through the sword, but through the sword of the Spirit, by converting them.
That's right.
Converting them. And that's so important. It's not a militaristic thing as Israel wanted to become. It's the sword of the Spirit. It's the power of the Messiah that actually brings change through the gospel, through men and women, through even the standpoint of that, wherever you're at in your world, in your life, if you're a lawyer, a doctor, a janitor, baseball player, whatever it is, you become a believer, you have to live your faith out. And what's that means? That means that you are going to impact people. Yeah. That's it. And that's what he's calling us to do.
Yeah. No, that's good. And I think it is important that you mentioned that there are actually these false prophets rose up amongst the apostles.
Yeah.
Only because usually we can sniff out kind of a cult leader.
Yeah.
But when they start in the church as a teacher among the teachers, and then they start to spew heresy, that's when they actually have a lot of impact. And destruction among us. So no, that's good. So I don't think I have any qualms about this specifically. Okay. You use a lot of evidence. You got a lot of different texts. Is there anything specifically you want to point out in this particular area?
Let me see.
I think you pretty much.
It's kind of a lengthier chapter. Yeah. Honestly, yes.
Yeah.
Verse 14.
Yes. This good news
is
right?
huge. So
that's right.
Let's just talk about it.
Yeah.
Because that one I've talked about so much.
Yeah.
So Matthew, when he talks about it, he says, this good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed in all the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end
and
will
then
come.
the end will come. The end of the age,
Yes.
which your perspective is the Adamic or the Jewish age.
They're kind of both together. They're different, but in a sense, yeah. But ultimately, it's the end of the Jewish age. Now, there isn't a verse that says Jewish age,
right?
But Hebrews is very clear about the shaking of the heavens and the earth in the old covenant system become obsolete. So that's where more of that language comes from. So the thing is, so when he uses the word here, world, it's actually the Greek word oikumene, which means basically the surrounding region or the land that basically of Roman occupancy. And so, but because, in a sense, it's translated as world, the thought is this becomes a huge missiological passage, does it not? Basically, if we get to every single nation and preach the gospel, the end will come. Yeah. And it's used constantly for that. But the context here is that the word used is oikumene. Now, one person had challenged my perspective, said, well, basically it's just kind of like he's choosing to use that one. He kind of uses it back and forth, like almost like a synonymous
with
thing.
Which word?
With like Gia or cosmos, right? Yeah. Well, the thing is, Matthew only uses that word to say world this time in the whole Gospel of Matthew. He uses world for different types, but for this one, he uses oikumene. Right now, we also see oikumene used in Luke 2 when he talks about the census coming over the world.
That's right.
It's translated as Roman territory, right? The nation, the surrounding nations. He's not saying the globe here. He's talking about this world. And again, and it makes sense because why? He's understanding what Jesus is talking about. There is a time frame here. This is the world that they have to do what? Proclaim the good news, the good tidings. The good news is that the king is here. It's not, because remember, redemption has to come to Israel. It has to come to them. That's still part of the promises. So the good news is that what God has done in Christ for Israel, because remember, they've been scattered too. If you read the book of Acts 2, he says that everybody, all Jews under heaven from every nation was here. So the point is you have Jews that are scattered out. The good news, in a sense, at this point, is not about the inclusivity of Gentiles, because Gentiles are like, what are you even talking about? They don't know the Jewish scriptures. They have no idea about God's purposes of redemption. What are you even talking about? But God is fulfilling his purposes first to the Jew, right? Then the Gentile. So God is still doing that. So the whole point here is that he's saying to them that this good news of the kingdom, right, will be proclaimed. That's what he's saying. The kingdom is at hand. The kingdom is here. And it's a testimony, not disciple making. It's a testimony. It's a witness about Christ. So that's what's happening, not the end of the world. This isn't a call for missions that basically if we go and we preach the gospel to every single nation on this earth, then the end will come. Because here's the one thing. He said nobody knows the day or the hour. So we could actually say that we've reached every single nation, right? We track it. We track it in our statistics, our people groups, right? We track it. So that means that we're saying that we could actually know that, but he makes a point that you can't know that. And that, again, but it goes back to us being in that inclusio of this generation. And that's where I say, so I think Matthew using that word, it's a stretch to say that he's actually basically using it as a synonym. It's the only time he uses that word, oikumene. Nowhere else does he. And so I don't think you can make the argument that actually a New Testament guy that I was reading his commentary, that was just a real blanket kind of like, well, it's just kind of like he's just choosing to use it that way. Or he means the same thing. You can't do that. We know that we can't, they use certain words for a certain reason, and that's part of interpretation. Is why is he using oikumene when there's other terms to use of the global world? He's choosing not to use that only this time. That has to be something that really causes people to think.
I see. Well, in verse 13, when he says, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. So most people think that's at the end of the tribulation area.
Yeah, they think it's the end of everything, right?
7-year period. And if you don't give in to the mark of the beast, then and you endure, then you will be saved.
Yes.
What is this in reference to in your perspective then?
So again, they told them that there's going to be severe persecution. We know that the persecution came heavily from the Jews. That was their persecutors. They were protected from Rome at this time because Rome had the Pax Romana, where basically, in a sense, they in a sense kind of stayed away from, in a sense, bringing down any type of different types of groups or religions, in a sense, that didn't conflict with Rome. They didn't do that. And they always saw that Christians were just a sect of Judaism. So it wasn't like a problem, because why? Jews were okay of being submissive to Caesar. I mean, the Pharisees said that we only have one king, Caesar, John 17. Like, so they were okay of swearing allegiance to Caesar. But the Christians started saying what? Jesus is Caesar. Jesus is Lord. And that became the kind of sense, the clarion call that we don't submit to Caesar, we submit to the Lord Christ. And that's where that became divided from them. And Jews are like, hey, they're not part of us. But the heavy persecution came heavily from the Judaizers at first. That's what the New Testament talks about. It's from them. And so the whole point is that you endure this time, because there was going to be, obviously, the Romans will come in. That was totally going to be something to look for. And so you have the Judaizers, and then you have the Roman armies coming in around 66 AD through there. That becomes the kind of end of it. But the point is that one, and I think it's both and. I think true. One of the challenges that the New Testament writers had to face was, especially in Hebrews, was going back to the law of Moses. Think about when Paul opposed Peter to his face, right, in Book of Acts, and the challenges in Galatians. Like, there was this tendency to go back to Moses. Why? There was pressure. They were scared. Like, wait a minute, this is all we know. And so it's like, wait a minute. And what would happen is, if they didn't, they were thrown out of the temple. They had everything cut off from them if they didn't do what? Submit to the law of Moses. And so there's this constant, kind of pressure on that. And so what happens? They were persecuted. They were in prison for that, for preaching Christ, right? So the whole point is, if you endure all this, you will be saved. And that's when he tells them later on to flee to the mountains. Flee to the mountains. And that's, in a sense, if you continue to move and not stay in these towns, go from one town to the next, you will be saved. You will be saved temporarily, physically in your life, but also, too, those that don't shrink back, I think it's also, there's eternal ramifications. Because here's the thing. If you don't follow what he says and you go with the Judaizers, and you, in a sense, recant in the name of Christ and go back on what he says, that's going to be judgment for you. There's going to be a physical judgment you're going to experience, but also an eternal judgment. Because why? You've rejected the gospel, the Messiah, just like the other Jews have, and you have now gone back to them. There's judgment for that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Verse 15. This is where lots of different perspectives start to come in. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains.
Yeah.
The abomination of desolation, it's not referring to Smaug the dragon from The Hobbit, right? So, but it is referring to a specific event in history.
Yeah.
There are those who think that this is a double fulfillment verse where it did happen in AD 70 when the Romans sacked the temple and essentially wiped out the priests and spilled their blood in the temple and then set it on fire. And then that'll happen again in some kind of reestablished Rome with a third temple and the Antichrist in that third temple recreating some familiar abomination that makes desolation.
For sure.
I know that he does reference Daniel, and you do talk about this reference in Daniel. You want to explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So we know that the Daniel's context ultimately was speaking towards, I mean, any New Testament scholar will look at the Maccabean revolt, look at the 167 BC as far as from Daniel. Like, that's what he was referring to. And we have extra biblical literature, historical literature that supports that. We have books that were in that time. And so we have those accounts. And so the point that where it's the reference to Daniel is that he says, let the reader, right? Let the reader what? Understand. So the whole point was like, let the reader understand like what happened before. What happened before that what took place, right? When I say abomination of desolation, which was what happened? The temple was desecrated, right? I mean, Zeus was erected, everything, right? But understand, this is happening to Israel. This is happening to Jerusalem. And so it's not a double fulfillment. He just basically bringing them back to what happened in the past, right? This is now going to happen to them. So they're two distinct historical events. And that's what I mean by that. It's like, it's saying that, it's not to say that Daniel is talking about really both of these as being the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, and Luke is more descriptive about that. Like he's very precise about that, right?
Well, I find it fascinating because prophets in the Old Testament, especially Isaiah, Jeremiah, they tend to use imagery of the plagues of Egypt
Mm-hmm.
as if that were happening to
Yeah.
them, like locusts. But really, it's armies coming against them.
Yes.
So it's not unheard of for a prophet to like make a reference to an Old Testament scripture
Mm-hmm.
to describe something that's also going to happen to them.
For sure.
So it's not necessarily that it'll happen verbatim,
Mm-hmm.
but the imagery explained in the text is what's going to essentially take place.
Yeah, and then Luke even interprets it for us. He says, when you're surrounded by the armies, recognize the desolation. So he's very clear about it because he has a different audience. Because the Jews understand abomination of desolation, but Luke is writing to more of a Gentile audience.
Right.
They don't understand that throwback, if you will,
right.
to Daniel, right? They don't understand. So that's why Luke is more precise that way. So he's telling them that abomination of desolation is the gathering of the Roman armies. And what do? They come and they sack Jerusalem. They put up their ensigns. They put up their eagles, and they basically say, "Hey, we've conquered this. We've taken it as ours. We brought it down."
Very good.
But double fulfillment would say, "Oh, that still is going to happen today. Like there's going to be this temple, and we're going to see it happen." I don't think the text has any warrant for that. That's a later discussion.
Fair enough. So when he says those people who are on the housetop must not go down to get things out that are in his house, whoever's in the field must not turn back to get his cloak, but woe to those who are pregnant. And to that's not talking about some future tribulation. That's talking about the sacking of the temple, which is contrary to what they would have naturally wanted to do in a time of a siege, because Jerusalem was the capital. Yeah. But it was also a fortress on a hill.
Yes.
A military installment. So they had walls. They were that's where you were supposed to go when you see an army marching toward you. So for Jesus to say, don't stay there.
Yes, don't.
Go into the mountains. That would be contrary to some kind of to anything
because you're vulnerable that way.
That's right. Yeah,
you're vulnerable out there, and so I mean, I think that's a good point that you said that. I should have said that because I didn't touch on it to that perspective. Like that's the natural instinct is to hide in the fortress, right? He's saying you've got to flee. You've got to flee, and he even says here that pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. Now, why on a Sabbath? Because everybody's going to be in the temple. Everybody's going to be in there. Right. You're just going to be like a fish in a barrel. So pray it's not that day, right? Because you're going to get locked in. They're going to close the gates. So again, that's the audience of his day.
That's right. Yeah, good. And then it says, unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. For the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Some people have a hard time with that verse. Even for me, like I have a hard time for what that really means. But some people, with the idea that this is a future text, they think that there's going to be some kind of like cosmic grace by God where he cuts days short. They're not as long as they used to be. Because the tribulation of that 7-year tribulation at the end is going to be so intense that if God doesn't cut those days short, then everybody would just be wiped out. What is that in reference to?
So basically it's him showing that for the sake of his love for his people, right? That he's actually enduring this long. He's giving
for which people? The Jews or the believers?
For the Jews and all those believing at this time. 100%. Now, the one thing I will say it is strange to me that Matthew uses the word elect. He doesn't really use it at all. And so I know that's where I've heard arguments say, well, because he's using an elect, which is more of like a church term later on, like you see in Paul, that he has to be speaking about the future. But again, this is the conclusion. But for the sake of the elect, all these things that we're talking about, those days will be cut short. So,
and it's very clear that he's talking about the sacking of Jerusalem.
Yes, he's not making it last where he's going to go and just continue to wipe everything out. He's making the day short for them.
I think that's why it's so important that context determines the meaning of a word.
Yes,
because I think we tend to be guilty. I don't know. This is true for me. Of reducing a word to mean only one thing all the time. Yes. Like I've heard people say all means all, and that's all. all means. And I'm like, that doesn't even mean anything.
Yeah,
like, to me,
it doesn't.
So
It doesn't. Yeah, that's funny.
But within the context, like when John is baptizing, and he says, and all in Jerusalem came out to be baptized by him. It's like, well, that doesn't mean every single person in the city. So within the text, when I would have read it, elect, for me, that would have been like, oh, those are the predestined believers.
Yeah, you insert predestination in there.
But within the text, it seems clear that it means
his people. He's called out. Yeah,
the Jews. So there tends to be some grace even in his condemnation, which is consistent with the prophets of the Old Testament.
Yes, it is.
He's always condemning and he's always judging, but then at the same time showing grace and like, I'm gonna save some of you, or I'm gonna have bring you back, or some kind of grace in the middle of judgment.
Yes. So there's a great theme. It's called Salvation Through Judgment. There's a great biblical theology book on it, written by James Hamilton. I think it's called Salvation Through Judgment. He goes through the entire Bible and just tracks that theme all throughout. Now he and I don't agree on preterism or postmillennialism, but that theme he identifies is really, really good. And this is another example of God's grace of through judgment. He's redeeming his elect.
Great. Yeah. Then you talk about in verse, you talk about the tribulation of that day.
Okay.
In verse 29, I think everything else. Oh no, wait! Before we go there, false Christ, false prophets. We already know those are going to be the false messiahs that Josephus and the text talk about. Behold, I've told you in advance. So if they say to you, and that's these false prophets, if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out there. Behold, he's in the inner rooms, don't believe. Just as the lightning, right? Because I think you break this down really well. Just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the parousia, the coming of the Son of Man, be.
Yeah.
This is the text that I think helps or kind of distorts a lot of people's perspective, because in that one verse, they're like, well, then everything else must be future also, because that's talking about the coming of the Son of Man.
Yeah.
Because there's other texts like 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and 1 Peter, and they all talk about the day of the Lord and the return of Christ. But in your perspective, that's not talking about the second advent.
No, I think who's the greatest Baptist theologian?
The greatest Baptist theologian.
I think you even have like a center on it.
Oh yeah. Wait, he's Jonathan Edwards? I don't think.
No,
I was going to say.
It's John Gill.
Oh, okay.
John Gill is considered to be the greatest.
Oh, John Gill. Okay.
John Gill, right? He's considered the greatest.
I'm gonna get chewed out by David
Rayfield's gonna take you down, man. Right?
Everybody.
So let's hear what John Gill says.
Okay.
He says, John Gill remarks, the lightning depiction is to indicate, quote, the sudden, visible, powerful, and general destruction of that nation, Jerusalem, as the light that comes from the east and in a moment shines to the west. So he sees it as a judgment coming. Now, again, there are different opinions, but my whole point again is to say, here's John Gill, who's a few hundred years ago, even longer, right? Seeing this from a standpoint of the context is that he's getting, it goes back to the questions. It goes back to the questions. They're supposed to see these things. So it can't be something where they've been dead, buried, and gone that still hasn't happened yet. They're supposed to see these things. So John Gill is trying to stay in there. So the point is, when lightning flashes, what does it do? It lights everything up, everything up, and it's powerful in an instant. So that's the whole point, is that's going to be the presence of God, is that's how you're going to know, right? That's the coming of the Son of Man has happened. And that's how he's kind of using it there. And he says, where the carcass is, there the vultures will gather. Interestingly, the Greek word is actually eagles. And the Romans put up eagles. So there's a thought that, hey, I mean, that's one interpretation, because it's where he uses eagles here in the Greek. But we do know from a standpoint of cursing, the bodies are left for the vultures to go and feed on them.
That's right.
Right. Yeah. So that we symbolize it as cursing.
It's in the law. God says he was going to curse him with that.
Yes.
The prophets talk about birds feeding.
Yes.
This imagery of prey feeding,
to not be buried and gathered to your people is a curse.
It's a curse. Yeah.
So you can see it both ways. It is interesting that Matthew uses the term eagles, though.
Yeah. Then honestly, 15 through 28 always gave me trouble. 29 through 31 was actually the ones that didn't really give me trouble.
Okay.
I understood when I started questioning it. These are the texts that really started forcing me to kind of consider a different perspective, especially from Isaiah and from Jeremiah, who uses these same kind of images when it comes to the judgment of God. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, meaning the destruction of the temple, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light and the stars will fall from the sky and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. So there's not going to be blood moons before the return of Christ?
Nope.
So what are we doing with these blood moons, man?
And okay, but that's the problem. And that's the North American evangelical bubble of Left Behind theology. I mean, you look at Left Behind, the late great Planet Earth sold 70 million copies in this country. They came out like in 1971, right? So then you have the Left Behind series. So you have a whole eschatology shaped by popular novels. And then you have a group of theologians, Dallas Theological Seminary, that now tries to put some teeth behind it academically. And it becomes like this very huge movement. And unfortunately, people that have caught into it, because the whole point is that if this stuff doesn't happen, then like what's going on then? Like books don't sell if this already happened. You know what I'm saying? So it's kind of like, I think that's been a big part of it. There's been a great book I read, published by Oxford Press, University Press, called Writing the Rapture. And this guy, writing the rapture, writing.
Oh, right. I thought you meant like writing. No. RID, like no, we're writing out this.
No,
this concept.
It's called Writing the Rapture.
Okay.
And he just traces out how in the early 1900s, how like the whole idea of like that we know everyone can picture the image of like the airplane, right? Also, the pilot disappears, the people disappear next to him, their clothes are there. Well, this was a pastor, like, I think in the early 1900s, that was waiting to go on an airplane and was thinking about, wouldn't that be crazy if, like, the pilot, like, just disappeared from his seat? And so he wrote a book kind of talking about this end times thing. And you had a lot of writers continue to parrot that same kind of ideology. But you had pastors writing these kind of novels about things that became very popular. And so the point is that you know, I'm gonna kind of frame this in a way of as a way of I don't want to take like a cheap shot, but the point is like people have made the claim that preterism is some kind of, you know, fringe kind of new thing. Well, honestly, that kind of left behind premillennialism that we kind of see a lot is a new thing itself. It 100%, it quite is. Now,
it's within the last 200 years.
Less than that. And so, but my point is too, now people can say, well, the early church fathers were premillennials. Well, here's the thing, it's very important. And I say this in my book, that it'd be historically inaccurate for me to say that Augustine was a post-millennial, because I'm then saying that the system that I view now post-millennial, I'm putting it upon him saying he held this way. No, he was very heavily post-millennial in his ideology about things, but not a worked out system like we have now. Same thing for premillennials. And so, but the problem is people will try to use the historical view to support their position and say, you know, Irenaeus was like this or Athanasius. The thing is like you can't do that. It's naive to do that.
Yeah, like when people say that Augustine was the first reformed guy. It's like, no, he wasn't. Like, what does that even mean?
And to your point, if we were to debate somebody and rely on the historical argument, you could have an Arminian say, well, really kind of Calvinistic ideology, where I'm going to be anachronistic here, didn't really come about until Augustine. The early church fathers didn't really see it that way. So therefore your argument's invalid.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, then if we're going to use that, we have to then invalidate Reformed theology. We would have to, because of predestination, election, radical depravity. All those things weren't really a hot topic until Augustine. And so it's important that we always kind of keep that in mind.
That's right. Yeah.
All right. So the point is, back to this, that this passage here, and to your point, you heard the prophets of old using this to depict a major event happening. So likewise, Jesus, as the prophet, is following in step with them. Why? Because he was trying to communicate to them something they would understand. Again, it's their interpretive reference.
That's right.
That's why he's using it. Not to speak of like something that's completely out of this world. It's so his people would understand what he's talking about, because of the familiarity of it from the Old Testament.
Yeah, the language, the prophetic language, and not charismatic prophetic, but Old Testament prophets. You know, the prophetic language was that every single time you find instances of these kinds of terms, it was always in terms of judgment. Yeah. Of God's judgment. And usually the judgment was through an army. Yeah. It was always somebody coming to destroy them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we've used that kind of language. I mean, I played sports all my life. We have baseball. We had a team, we beat them 18-0. Man, we destroyed those guys. we didn't literally destroy their bodies into pieces, right? But we're showing how bad we beat them.
Yeah, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. Now, this one still gives me trouble because there's certain elements in it that makes me want to say, well, that doesn't sound like a preterist. Like, I have a hard time having a preterist reading of it. The disciples ask for a sign of his coming. He says, "This is the sign." All the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. Great glory.
Yeah.
I understand your perspective. I can see how the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky is a reference to Daniel 7. I can see that. But specifically, all the tribes of the earth will mourn. That seems very resurrection futuristic. Like, now everybody's going to see Christ coming and returning. Then all the tribes of the earth will see him and they will mourn.
Okay.
How do you understand this in light of your perspective?
Well, do you have the passage in front of you?
Yeah.
Is there a little footnote?
Not in this one. This is an NASB, but maybe in another one.
Okay. Well, let's see. I'll go that to mine. So here it says.
Oh, is there a variant there?
Well, basically, if there should be a little like a footnote or like a letter that says, and below it says, or all the tribes of the land. See, it's not earth, it's land.
It's Gase.
It's land. I think I have it written out. I even talk about it here. Let me see. Because Gase would be earth, land, but let me see here.
So is it talking about the 12 tribes of Israel here? Is that your perspective?
Yeah. So basically it's, because again, this has to make sense to them and they're going to mourn, right? It's a
so we have poor translations.
Well, we have influence translations, right? You know, so ultimately that's, I don't have my Greek with me, but the whole point is that really the actual word is land. The word is land.
You need a Greek text?
Well, I got my Greek text on my phone. It's I should know that on top of my head. It's a simple one. Excuse me.
No worries. That's why we have phones, man.
I know.
Logos
I'm okay.
Is a save.
I try to keep up my Greek. Let me see, 24:30, and some man's guy. All the, yeah, you're right. It is Gase. Yeah, it is Gase. Duh. So that's the point. Is that, like, again, and he's using a passage from the Old Testament. In
your perspective, it's within the context of the world and not being the cosmos or the whole world, but that particular geographical location.
Yes, because the mourning is, because remember, this is all about vindication. Vindication. So the Son of Man is one who is given a kingdom, given a people, and he's vindicated as the representative for Israel and those that belong to God. So it's a passage of vindication. So it's not going to be, again, we're still within the confines of the generation. So then if we're going to stay in there, we have to say, what would this mean to them? And he's using passages from Zechariah, from Daniel. And so when we look at the text where it says the sign of the Son of Man will appear. So we know that New Testament writers will take a phrase or two from a prophecy, and the whole point is it's like an indicator word. Like when they say that phrase, what is the Son of Man about? It's Daniel. But then you also have extra biblical literature in the 1st and 2nd centuries that even kind of expounded on it, gave an interpretation of what Daniel means. So you have it like in was it 2nd Ezra or 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch? Like, so those are very the Second Temple literature is very helpful in showing us how they interpreted the Daniel 7 passage. And so them was all about a representative being vindicated, his people being vindicated. So, but even in Daniel 7, you can see that. So my point is, it's not so much a judgment passage, it's a vindication passage. And so they're mourning because why? The sign that he has been vindicated, the sign of the Son of Man coming to fruition, right, is the destruction of Jerusalem, is the old covenant system being covenant down. That's the vindicative moment. And they're going to mourn because they rejected that. That's the mourning. The validity to what Christ said is not happening. And they told them to look for this. So when we say then the sign of the Son of Man will appear. It should be Ochronos in the heavens.
Mm.
So it's actually more written. I even have there. It's the sign that the Son of Man is in the heavens. Like that's so the sign that Son of Man is in the heavens is this, not that something you see. Now he does say, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Now we know that the Old Testament has cloud judgment, where God moves in on clouds of chariots in the sky. That language is used for sure. But the Son of Man has been vindicated. And here's the thing. What's his next step after being enthroned? Judgment. So, and the coming on the clouds of heaven is judgment language we see in the Old Testament. We don't automatically assume that it's spoken of Daniel 7, 13, and 14, because we know in that standpoint, he's escorted to the Ancient of Days on the clouds. He's going to, not coming down. So while there's an allusion to that, it's not a direct, because if you're going to say that's a fulfillment of that, he doesn't come down in any clouds. He goes to the Ancient of Days. And then in my new paper that I write, I think that one, because you think about it, the stuff that was apocalyptic was visions, stuff seen in visions. We never really take them as be like, this is historically accurate. You're going to see these wheels spinning in the sky like in Ezekiel, right? So they've always been that way. But then you have in Acts 1:9, you have them being carried away in a cloud. So my thought is that what it is that the whole part of that is that there's the Son of Man, one from earth, who now is in the sphere of the earth. Now he goes through that curtain and is escorted before the Ancient of Days in the heavenly world. That's the vision. So Daniel gives us the back half of the vision, because he says, then immediately I saw one like the Son of Man being escorted. So he gives the back half of the vision.
Interesting.
Right? But the first half plays out historically. The back half plays out in the visions. We can't go to the throne room of God. We don't. That's where he goes. So that's how I kind of understand that. My paper kind of fleshes that out, actually. So that's how I would see this. Now, I think a passage to support, because again, I remember even Schreiner saying, it sounds like he's saying that they will see, like you'll visibly see something. Like you're going to see the Son of Man. But again, that's not an interpretive reference for them to think the Son of Man was coming on the clouds, because they going back to the vision, the Son of Man was brought before the Ancient of Days. They're not seeing that, right? So it all goes back to the presence of God. The presence that the Son of Man is in heaven is the destruction, is the judgment, is the bringing down of the old covenant system. That's what they're to be looking for. And again, there'll be mourning. Interpreters will say there's mourning of the standpoint of not receiving their Messiah, and then there's mourning of vindication. Yes, we've been vindicated. We've been vindicated. That's the big. Now that is true. Back to Daniel 7, that the people are going to be vindicated for believing in the Christ, for believing in the Messiah, the vindication. So your belief is not going in vain. Who I said I was is true, and this is how I'm demonstrating it.
And you do I think you make a reference to when Stephen gets stoned and he sees the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power.
Yes.
I think you said that could be, when
he had a vision of some sort, for sure, right? Because nobody else saw that. But when you have Jesus talks to the high priest, says from now on, you will see the Son of Man. And that's why he tore his robe. So what is he declaring? He's declaring that he's the one fulfilling that. So he's using the example they know of and saying from now on, this is what you're seeing. And so even my paper too is fascinating, is that in the high priest's use of his authority to declare him a blasphemer, right? It's actually, when Jesus says that you will see this, it's a transfer of authority. Because now you have a heavenly one, an earthly one, a Son of Man, now having a kingdom, all dominion, glory, and power. The power that the high priest had, he's losing it. So in a sense, by him giving him over to be crucified, is that transfer of that authority to Christ. It's kind of a fascinating theme to think about that. So basically, it's the undoing of the Jewish leadership.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. And then in verse 31, and he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from the end of the sky to the other. Again, I have a hard time with this one. It still sounds like this is the final gathering, the final intaking of the redeemed. But if we're going to be consistent with what you've been saying, this has to be in reference to this generation.
Yeah.
So the gathering of the elect. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So now remember, our translation says angels, but it's just messengers.
That's right.
The context determines if it's truly an angelic being or just messengers like you and I. So again, I think that that's an interpretive influenced translation by a theology already kind of preset there, right?
Yeah, it is funny that the subheading of this particular passage in verse 29 is the glorious return.
Yeah, glorious return, right? And the gathering together is a regathering of the people. It's actually episynagoge, which means gathering, right? So in a sense, because remember, the whole point is that they've been spread out, and so because of this transition, those that have been spread out, he is now the messenger going out with the gospel to bring them in. Because remember, the gathering now is no longer a location; it's in Christ.
So is this kind of like a parallel to verse 14? Where the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony of all the nations? Or is this the actual sending forth of evangelists to the rest of the world after the destruction of Jerusalem?
So, I will, and I think I even say this in this text. I kind of struggle on this passage a little bit. I think I even admit, even at the very end, I admit, coming from a futurist background, out of all the passages of the Olivet Discourse, the Preterist interpretation of this one is the most challenging for me to receive. Now, I would say this. I would say that because part of that is that obviously we know in the destruction of Jerusalem that there are those that are going to be up in Macedonia that aren't going to visually see this. But there are those that fled. There are those that the church has been spread out. The Jews have. And so the whole point is that now they're going to be gathered. So the gathering, again, is not bringing people into before the presence of Christ. It's now to be gathered as a people of God, period. And so I would say it's still part of that. But however, I think I would be probably say I might be a little inconsistent because it seems to happen after this. So on one hand, it could be a reference to saying it's basically it's human evangelization, which I write. I put here, I think I cite France, RT Francis. In the context of this passage, based on the vision of Daniel 7, it probably refers to the spiritual power underlying human evangelization. Think about that, right? As messengers of God, we carry the spirit and truth. We carry the word that actually brings people into the house of God. That's how we use it now. Christ is at the throne of the right hand of the Father. We now have the gospel, which is what gathers people. So on one hand, you could say that because then I think it's in line with that. On the other hand, it seems to be something more than just the testimony. Now it's truly like, hey, God's people can gather now. Okay. No needing to hide anymore in a sense, because why? I've brought down Israel. I've destroyed them. Remember, in the siege of Jerusalem, 1 million Jews were killed and 1 million were taken and put in slavery. 1 million. I mean,
that's huge.
On a comparative scale, it trumps the modern day Holocaust of Auschwitz.
Yeah, in terms of population.
Population-wise, it absolutely is insane. I mean, wiped out. So they left from that. And so I would say that really that after this happens now, as messengers with the gospel, you go out and you bring them together as the people of God. And again, the location is gone now because why? He's already raised the new temple and demonstrated his power as king and having all glory and authority and power. So therefore, there's no need to hide anymore because what was there has been taken down. So I would kind of probably connect it there, but like I said, I don't want to be dogmatic about that because I really think more the actual Great Commission passage is what he says at the end of Matthew 28, right? But the transition between this one and that one is that in one hand, in the Olivet Discourse, he was talking about a testimony to the nations, but at the end of Matthew is disciple the nations, bring them under to obedience. So one, the announcement the king is here. At the end of 28 says, now all power and authority has been given to me. Go therefore. So now that he basically has been raised in power, the power you have to go out and to disciple the nations, I will be with you to the end of the age. So could there be some overlap there? There might be. But again, I do want to stay true to the context because he says that after that, he says all these things will take place. So obviously something local happens. And maybe it is just a regathering of the people of God following the destruction of Jerusalem. Or now they've got, obviously church has already been planted, but like now there's the same point the people of God can now gather. That could be it. I don't know. I want to be honest. I don't know, but I do want to stick to my guns and say, hey, this lands when he is part of all these things will happen in this generation.
Very good.
Yeah.
All right. To finish up, 32 through 36, this is essentially where your exegesis ends as well.
Yes, and I say here, I mean, let's see. Yeah, I wrote basically a page and a half here. I'm the fig tree by nature, sprouts its leaves on the cusp of summer. So the whole thing is that. Oh, actually, I do want to say this. He says that when you see all these things, recognize that he is near at the door.
At the door.
At the door, right? So obviously, he's not standing behind a door, but again, it's the presence of God who's coming to do these things, and the power of Christ to know that he's doing this, and so everything is to point to that. Now, I want to mention about this near at the door because I know a lot of futurists will say, well, near or at hand or at the door doesn't really mean that. It means like when it does happen, then it'll be near or at hand or close. And I think it's maybe more of a tangent kind of thing, but a lot of futurists will take these kind of passages that speak of happening now, happening soon, quickly, and say, well, when it does happen soon, then it'll be quickly. But my question is, how do you interpret, how do you actually, then what's the word to say that? Why can't they say, well, when this does happen, when it does happen, then it'll be quickly? They don't say that.
Yeah.
It's given with a force of urgency.
Well, I always understood it, at least this is my perspective, that the door, the word for door there could also mean gates. And that just as the siege would have happened at the gates of Jerusalem, that the judgment of Christ would come at their gates. So I don't know.
And that's a good way. No, I mean, I think that's a good point. I think, recognize he's at the door. I mean, the gates of Jerusalem.
He's the one sending this destruction,
Yep, absolutely.
The siege upon them. So truly I say to you, verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation, that's that phrase that you, through which you interpret the rest of the text. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place, specifically referring to the disciples, those in the high priest, those of that generation, 40-year time frame, 30 AD to 70 AD.
Yes.
That generation will not pass away. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass. Again, heaven and earth referring to apocalyptic literature and Old Testament prophets saying like your world is going to end.
Yes.
But my words that I'm saying to you, they're not going to end.
Or you can look at it as a way of just his putting his stamp on it.
That's right.
Like no matter what, my word reigns true. So when you see, yes, the heavens being shaken, the stars coming down, your world is coming to end, understand my words are not going to pass away. This is going to happen. Yeah.
In verse 36, I think is, I wanted to hear your perspective, but of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son of Man, but the Father alone. Yeah. What do you make of that text?
Yeah. So, I guess again, and I didn't reiterate this, but I want to say this. This book was more of me just kind of working through this for myself. And at the time where I was studying this, I obviously leaned on certain people. So I think like Bonson and Gentry in France, R.C. Sproul, other guys, even think Doug Wilson, like they see this kind of transition of the subject matter. And actually you can grammatically see there is a transition because the first part up to that point, he gives them things to see and to look for. The rest of it is basically things that you're not going to see, not to look for, almost kind of be ready. And he gives the parables, right, of the women with the oil, what's it called? The ones with what is it? I forget. My point is that those things to look for disappear. So basically maybe he is transitioning to a true second coming because of that day, which is the final day that I do come to bring judgment. Nobody knows that. And he gives the example, obviously, like the days of Noah, right? They basically were hanging out, eating and drinking, and then bam, everything came. But, and I think it's a funny thing when I first was working through this and kind of landed on this position, and I give the reasons why in this chapter, my wife was like, but I don't think he's doing that. I think he's talking about the same thing. Because, I mean, it doesn't make sense to just kind of go, and that day. What he's saying is, of that day, when the judgment does come, right, nobody knows. He's given this generation, but the final day, when the actually judgment does happen against Israel, nobody knows the day or the hour. So, like I said, Sproul, R.T. France, Ken Gentry, Bonson, Wilson, they take it to be that way. People like Keith Matheson, Gary DeMar, others, they lean that, no, he's still talking about the same thing. So I will say this. At the time of writing this, I think the arguments were very good for saying that he's now changing the subject matter and speaking to the end time, because at the end of 25, what do you have? The separating the sheep and the goats. Right. We think judgment language. But if this is all about the Son of Man, then it has to stay within that context. He's not talking about an end times thing. It's still part of that. So I haven't worked that out yet. I'm not comfortable at the point saying that the end of 25 is still referring to 80, 70. That's why you have guys that are very solid that kind of see this kind of distinction in that at that verse. But I want to be consistent. So I will say I'm still open to study more in that. Like you said, that there's things that this passage comes to, like, man, I've always heard it this way. It's hard for me to think differently. And at this point, it didn't make sense to me for him to thinking about separating the sheep and the goats. And it seems like judgment language, because he also think about that like in the book of Revelation and how that's kind of played out. But the book of Revelation, from a preterist perspective, the majority of it happened in the first century also. So that you're seeing judgment language. Again, this is all visionary language. This is vision language. This is apocalyptic language. And so we can't take it as a literal one for one. Is indicating something. And so in one sense, you could say that he was separating the sheep from the goats by doing what? By reaching them with the gospel, by telling them to flee. And those that stayed, what did they receive? Judgment. Those that fled, what do they receive? Life. Those are my sheep. So that's how I think that would conclude. But honestly, ever since this book, I haven't really kind of gone into that further to kind of really kind of go through that passage by passage and read perspective. So at this time, I am comfortable sticking here, but I'm definitely open to seeing how it works out to the end if I can really get behind that and say, you know what, I find this to be a faithful reading.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Interesting stuff, man.
Yeah.
Well, I'm excited to hear about part 2.
Well, you know, I mean, I think at some point I'll make a revision. I think even some of the essays I've written, I want to kind of make them as part of the appendixes and stuff like that. But you know what? We'll see. The book I'm working on right now is going to be probably a multi-year like project, because I'm trying to really go through like everything I get my hands on that's been written about 2 Thessalonians. So, I mean, back to the very beginning of the church. I mean, I have so far in my bibliography, I think I'm pushing on 400 sources. I'm still gathering more stuff, but my whole point is to really kind of flesh that out. Now, there has been a work that came out, a series through Blackwell. They were a series of commentaries, and they're all entitled like Matthew through the years, Mark through the years. And so those authors went through church history and took excerpts of what various church fathers and people said on this passage, but they didn't really kind of take it to do any kind of critical evaluation. They just kind of did it more like it as a survey.
I see. Okay.
Mine's going to be that's going to be helpful to my work, but then I'm going to actually be constructive and kind of
add to it.
Yeah, add to it. So that's going to be kind of my next project.
Awesome.
So
the Olivet Discourse, a Preterist Reading, Dr. Brian J. Orr. Check it out. Amazon. You can get it for like what, $15 or something.
I think it's $18.99. I wish I made it cheaper, but
is it on Kindle?
It's on Kindle for I think $10.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Is it on audiobook yet?
No, I have a voice for radio, I've been told, so I got to do that.
You're going to record your own? Awesome.
But dude, I don't know. My mouth hurts and my jaw gets locked up, so I don't know. I might have AI do it for me.
Oh, that's genius.
Yes.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me
Thank you very
on
much,
Reform Perspective, man. Glad you're my first podcast in like 2 years.
Hey, all right.
And this is the longest one I ever done, almost 3 hours. So
no, I really appreciate that. I think this is a great thing to kind of work through. We basically worked for like the whole book.
Yeah.
So awesome.
All right, man. Appreciate you.
Thank you, brother.
All right. God bless.